The first thing he felt was cold. Not the cold of winter, not the cold of night. The cold of the earth that hadn't seen the sun in a long time. Ethan Pack lay face down on the wet grass and didn't understand why he was breathing. The last thing he remembered was the black water of the bay and the sound of the impact. Then nothing. And now the grass. He rolled onto his back and opened his eyes. The sky was gray, not overcast. Gray like a texture someone had forgotten to render. Cracks ran across it, blue, polygonal, like a bug in a cheap game's engine. Ethan blinked. The cracks remained. A translucent panel hung right in front of his face, blue text on a dark background. He read it 3 times. Player Ethan_Park, welcome to the world of Ash. Inventory synced. Class, controller. Unique. He tried to brush the panel away with his hand. The panel slid aside obediently, like a touchscreen. Behind it, another window opened. Status, Level 1. Health, 100 out of 100. Mana, 0. Combat skills, none. He stared at the line showing his mana. 0. Not 10, not 5. 0. His class was called Administrator, and he didn't have a single combat skill. Not a single one. 20 meters away, a child began to cry. A thin, weary cry. That's how children cry when they've been crying for a long time and don't expect anyone to come. A woman's voice quietly repeated the same thing over and over. Hang in there. Just hang in there a little longer. Ethan sat down. His head was spinning. The jacket he was wearing wasn't his. It was heavy, with a fur collar. He remembered clearly that he'd died in a t-shirt. He looked at the panel again. Inventory synced. Those 2 words wouldn't leave him alone. He knew what they meant. He knew it better than anyone on this planet. 7 years, $38,000, 400 people in the guild. The most well-stocked inventory on the Kingdom of Ash online server. His fingers moved on their own, a habit hammered into his muscle memory over thousands of hours. Swipe right, double tap, open inventory. The list unfolded before him like an endless table. Wheat flour, 40,000 units. Rice, 60,000 units. Salted meat, 12,000 units. Dried fruit, 8,000 units. Basic medicines, 3,000 units. Gold, 512,400. Summoning token, Spearman of the North, 100 heads, 47 pieces. He closed his eyes, opened them. The list hadn't disappeared. The child was still crying. Ethan slowly got to his feet. His knees were shaking. Not out of fear, because the product manager's brain had already done the math. 40,000 units of flour. 1 unit is roughly 1 kilogram. At a daily ration of 300 grams per person, for 200 people, that's about 660 days, almost 2 years. If they were fed only flour, if they didn't eat anything else, if they didn't share. He looked toward the sound of crying. Roofs were visible beyond a low hill. 13 or so, maybe 14, a small town. There was no smoke rising above it, not a single chimney. That meant the stoves weren't being stoked. That meant either there was no firewood, or there was no point in cooking because there was nothing to cook. Ethan headed toward the town. The road was in bad shape. The asphalt was cracked, and the same wet grass was pushing through it. An overturned pickup truck lay on the shoulder, old, rusty. Painted on the door was a word he didn't make out right away. Willow. Below it, in smaller letters, Welcome. The paint was peeling. Welcome sounded like a bad joke. A man with a shotgun stood at the town gate. The gate wasn't real. It was just 2 trucks parked across the road with a wire stretched between them. The man was thin, very thin. His cheekbones jutted out so much that it looked as if his skin was about to tear. He looked at Ethan and didn't say a word. He just stared. Ethan raised his hands, slowly. He said he had come alone, that he was a merchant, that he had merchandise. The man with the shotgun stared at him for a few seconds. Then he shouted to someone behind him. Another man came over. Ethan walked through the gate. Willow Creek turned out to be exactly what he'd expected, a small town that was dying slowly and quietly. The houses were intact but empty. The windows were boarded up. On Main Street, between two stores, someone had built a bonfire right on the asphalt. People were sitting around it, about 15 of them, women, old people, children. They stared at the fire and said nothing. Ethan counted 4 children in that group alone. The youngest was about 3 years old. He was sitting on a woman's lap, chewing on some kind of root. Ethan walked past them toward the building that had once been City Hall. A faded American flag hung above the entrance. Nearby, on the wall, someone had written in chalk, "Distribution at 6, by list only." He went inside. A man of about 55 was sitting at a table, bald, wearing glasses taped across the bridge of his nose with electrical tape. In front of him lay a crumpled notebook and a stub of a pencil. The man looked up and stared at Ethan expressionlessly. Ethan asked who was in charge here. The man replied that he was the mayor, a former school custodian, now the mayor. That's just how it turned out. Ethan sat down across from him and asked how many people were in the town. The mayor said 203. There had been 212, but 9 had died over the past 2 weeks. 3 elderly people, 1 woman in childbirth. 5 had gone out to look for food and hadn't returned. Ethan asked how much food was left. The mayor was silent for a long time. Then he said there was 1 bag of flour, 20 kilograms, for 203 people. Ethan asked how many days that would last. The mayor took off his glasses and wiped them with the hem of his shirt. His hands were shaking. He said that if divided among everyone, it would last a day and a half. But he had already made up his mind. The elderly and the seriously ill would be crossed off the lists. Then it would last 3 days, maybe 4. He said this in an even tone, as if reading a class schedule. Ethan was silent. He looked at the mayor's notebook. The lists were written in small handwriting, names, ages, notes. The letter K stood for child. The letter S stood for elderly. Some names were crossed out. Ethan counted 9 that were crossed out. Those were the ones who had died. Next to 6 of the elderly people's names were fresh pencil dots. The mayor hadn't crossed them out yet, but he had already marked them with dots. Ethan asked him for a pencil. The mayor handed it over. Ethan turned the notebook to a blank page and began counting. He counted for an hour. The mayor sat across from him and watched. Ethan wrote down numbers, small, neat, columns, rows. He was calculating water consumption, calorie intake, the number of able-bodied adults, the area of vacant buildings, the distance to the nearest water source. He asked questions. The mayor answered. Is there a warehouse? Yes, it's empty, by the east gate. Is there a water pump? Yes, it broke 3 months ago. Are there any literate residents? Yes, 3. A former teacher, a former accountant, a former mail carrier. An hour later, Ethan put down his pencil. He looked the mayor in the eye and said he had a caravan. It would arrive that night. Ethan would give the town 2 months' worth of flour, but in exchange, he needed the empty warehouse by the eastern gate, the right to repair the water pump, and 3 literate adults to handle the paperwork. And one more condition: the elderly must remain on the lists. The mayor looked at him for a long time. Then he asked what kind of caravan it was, where it was coming from, and who was behind it. Ethan replied that this was his condition, not to ask where it came from. The mayor asked, "What if he's lying?" Ethan said that if he were lying, There would be no flour in the morning, and the mayor would lose nothing. But if he wasn't lying, then 203 people would have something to eat in the morning. All 203 of them. The mayor was silent for a minute. Then he nodded. Ethan left City Hall and headed for the eastern gate. The warehouse turned out to be a former school bus garage. Large, empty, concrete floor. The roof was intact. It was just right. He waited until 2 in the morning. He made sure the streets were empty. He stood in the center of the warehouse. He opened the inventory, and he began unloading. The sacks appeared out of thin air, one after another, heavy, real. The flour smelled like flour. The 20-kilogram sacks hit the concrete floor with a dull thud. Ethan hauled them to the walls and stacked them in neat rows. An hour later, he was drenched in sweat. After 2 hours, his back ached. After 3 hours, the warehouse was 1/3 full. 600 sacks, 12 metric tons of flour. For 200 people, at a ration of 300 grams a day, that's exactly 200 days. He closed his inventory, sat down on the floor, leaned against the sacks. His hands were shaking, not from exhaustion, from realization. This was real. The flour was real. The world was real. The children gnawing on roots were real. He closed his eyes and thought that the product manager inside him would now say something very simple. They have a product. They had users. And they had a monopoly on food within a 50-kilometer radius. The first iteration was live. In the morning, the mayor opened the warehouse and stood in the doorway for 3 minutes without moving. Then he ran. Ethan heard him shouting. Half an hour later, a crowd had gathered outside the warehouse. People stared at the bags, unable to believe their eyes. A woman with a child, the same woman who had sat by the bonfire on Main Street yesterday, stood there crying silently, holding her son close. Someone was already dragging a bag toward the bakery that hadn't been open for half a year. By noon, the air in Willow Creek smelled of bread. Fresh, real, warm. The scent spread through the streets and wafted into the houses. People stepped out onto their doorsteps and stood there. They just stood there and breathed it in. Ethan sat on the steps of City Hall and watched it all. The mayor sat down next to him. He asked, "Who are you?" Ethan replied that he was a merchant, just a merchant. The mayor shook his head. He said that merchants don't do things that way. Ethan replied that this one does. By evening, 3 literate people were already sitting at a table in City Hall. A former teacher, a former accountant, a former mail carrier. Ethan laid out a notebook in front of them. 3 columns: income, expenses, balance. He explained slowly and patiently. Every sack must be recorded. Every portion distributed. Every mouth. No exceptions. No approximate figures. The teacher asked why it had to be so complicated. Ethan replied that when food runs out, people don't die of starvation. They die of chaos. When no one knows how much is left, panic sets in. When panic sets in, the strong take what they can, and the weak die. The only thing standing between order and chaos is a notebook. 3 columns: receipts, outgoing, balance. The accountant nodded. He was the first to understand. The mailman took a pencil and began copying the list of residents. The teacher opened a second notebook and started writing down the children's names. Ethan looked at them and thought this was the first team. 3 people, 1 pencil, 2 notebooks, and not a single combat skill among all 4 of them, including himself. But they did have a budget. A week later, Willow Creek had the world's first ash document, an accounting notebook. Income, expenses, balance. Ethan looked at the columns of numbers and, for the first time in 7 days in this world, felt as though he were standing on solid ground. On the 8th day, a woman with a medical bag slung over her shoulder arrived at the gates of Willow Creek. The guard at the gate called out to her. She introduced herself as Hannah So. She said she was a doctor. The guard looked at her and let her through without asking any questions. Hannah walked down the main street, counting. She was counting children. 4 on the porch, 3 by the well, 2 in the alley. All of them were thin, but alive. It was strange. She'd been walking toward this town for 3 days. Every settlement she'd passed before that had either been dead or dying. But here, it smelled like bread. She found the town hall. Inside, a young man of Asian appearance was sitting and counting something in a notebook. 3 locals stood next to him, silently watching the numbers. Hannah said she needed antibiotics, amoxicillin if available, tetracycline if not. Anything would do. She said that for the past month she'd been treating people with chamomile and boiling water, and that she had 3 people in her care with infected wounds who would die by the end of the week without antibiotics. The young man looked up at her. He was silent for a few seconds. Then he told her to wait. He stood up. He went into the back room. Hannah heard a strange sound, as if something had fallen to the floor out of nowhere. He came back with a cardboard box. He opened it. Inside were packages of amoxicillin, 10 of them, unopened, still in their factory wrappers. They were good for another 2 years. Hannah stared at the box and didn't move. He said he had more. He told her to make a list of what she needed and he'd get it for her. Just don't ask where it came from. Hannah looked up at him. She was a doctor. She was used to not asking unnecessary questions when a patient was on the table. She took the box. She said thank you, and she didn't ask. Ethan watched her walk away with a quick, confident stride, the stride of someone who knows where they're going and why. He thought he needed a doctor, not medicine. He already had medicine. He needed someone who knew what to do with it. He went back to his notebook. He started a new line. Medical department. 1 staff member, Hannah So. Not yet confirmed. By evening, Hannah was back. She brought a list, 2 pages, in small handwriting. 5 types of antibiotics, bandages, antiseptic, painkillers, surgical sutures, gloves, rubbing alcohol. She placed the list on the table and said that if he had even half of these items, she would stay. Ethan read the list. Then he said he had everything. Hannah sat down. For the first time during their conversation, she sat down. It was as if a core had been pulled out of her. She asked quietly how many people he had already lost. Ethan replied, 0. She looked up. He repeated, 0. Not a single one since he's been here. She was silent for a long time. Then she said that over the past year, she had lost 47. 47 people she hadn't been able to save. 12 of them were children. She fell silent. Ethan was silent too. He didn't tell her that everything would be all right. He didn't offer any comfort. He opened his notebook and showed her an empty building on the town map, a former pharmacy on the corner of 2nd Street. He said that would be her hospital. Tables would be delivered there tomorrow, medicine the day after tomorrow. In a week, she'd have clean water. He stated it as a fact, not as a promise, but as an item on a to-do list. Hannah looked at the map, then at him, then back at the map. She said she needed at least 1 assistant, someone with strong nerves. Ethan nodded. Noted. The next morning, 4 men with tools arrived at the pharmacy building. They carried out the old shelves. They washed the floor. They hauled in 2 tables from the school. Ethan personally brought 2 buckets and rags. Hannah stood in the doorway and watched. Then she rolled up her sleeves and started washing the walls. By lunchtime, the pharmacy began to resemble something vaguely like a doctor's office. Clean, bright. Instruments lay on the table. Medicines stood on the shelf. Hannah was arranging the packages and counting them. Ethan noticed that she was counting with her lips, silently, as if she were afraid that if she said the number out loud, it would decrease. He thought that for the past year, this woman had lived in a world where everything was in short supply. where every pill was a choice about who would live. He decided that around her, he would no longer say that supplies were limited, not because it wasn't true, but because she already knew. 3 days later, Hannah performed her first surgery at Willow Hospital. A man with an infected wound on his leg. The wound had been festering for a week. Without antibiotics, he would have lost his leg. With antibiotics and clean bandages, Hannah drained the abscess, cleaned the wound, and stitched it up in 40 minutes. The man was crying, not from pain, but because someone had spent 40 minutes and a box of medicine on him. Ethan stood in the hallway and listened. He didn't go inside. Medicine wasn't his area of expertise, but he wrote it down in his notebook. Surgery number 1. Patient, name, age, diagnosis, result, materials used. It was the first medical report in Willow's history. On the 10th day, Ethan began repairing the water pump. He wasn't an engineer, but he was a man who had spent 7 years playing a game where the crafting trees included a water supply section. He knew the basics: hand pump, pipe, filter, check valve. The problem was the valve. It had rusted through. Ethan spent 2 hours sifting through the inventory looking for something suitable. He found it. In the siege mechanisms section lay a set of bronze fittings. He pulled one out. It fit. Not perfectly, but close enough. He and 2 local men took the pump apart, replaced the valve, put it back together. When Ethan pulled the lever and water began to flow from the pipe, he heard someone gasp behind him. He turned around. About 30 people were standing by the water pump. They were watching the water, clean, clear, and flowing. One of the women cupped her hands, scooped up some water, took a sip, then scooped up some more and carried it to her children. Ethan stood there watching. The mayor approached him from the side. He quietly asked where the merchant had gotten the bronze fittings. Ethan replied that a good merchant has everything. The mayor grunted. He no longer believed in caravans, but there was plenty of flour and the water was flowing, so the mayor decided he didn't have to believe. By the end of the 2nd week, Ethan was sitting alone in City Hall at night. A notebook lay before him. He opened the inventory and counted the supplies. Flour, 39,400 units, minus 600 for the first shipment. Rice, 60,000, untouched. Gold, 512,400, untouched. Draft tokens, 47, untouched. Medicines, 2,973, minus 27. He jotted the numbers down in his notebook, drew a line, wrote the date. This was his personal ledger, the one no one else saw, the one that held the truth. 600 units of flour over 2 weeks for 203 people. If the population didn't grow, that would amount to 20,400 units a year. The supply would last for almost 2 years. But the population would grow, he knew that. Rumors about a town where there was bread spread faster than monsters could run. In a month, there would be 500 people here. In 3 months, 1,000. In half a year, he didn't bother counting any further. Instead, he opened a new page and wrote a single word at the top: farm. He underlined it twice. If Willow didn't have its own harvest in a year, then everything he was doing was just a slow death with bread instead of a quick death without it. He needed an agronomist. He needed land. He needed seeds. He had seeds. In his inventory, under the crafting resources section, there were little bags labeled seed grain: wheat, rye, barley. He'd never used them in the game. They'd been sitting there since the 3rd event. Now his life depended on them. He closed his notebook, blowed out the candle, lay down on the bench in the corner of City Hall, and closed his eyes. Behind the wall at the hospital, Hannah wasn't asleep yet. He could hear her walking, quiet footsteps on the wooden floor, back and forth. She was checking on a patient with a leg wound. Ethan thought that his team now consisted of 2 people, him and her. the logbook, and a box of antibiotics. That wasn't enough, but it was a start. In the morning, refugees arrived, the first ones, a family of 4, husband, wife, 2 children. They'd been walking for 2 days. They'd heard from someone on the road that there was a town where they gave out bread. Ethan met them at the gate. He wrote down their names, ages, and what skills they had. The husband was a carpenter. Ethan looked at him and said he needed a carpenter badly. He led the family to an empty house on 3rd Street. He brought blankets from the supply room, bread, a jug of water. The carpenter's wife stood in the doorway of their new home, looking at the blankets. Clean, warm. She asked quietly, "Is this really possible?" Ethan said it was. This is their home. As long as they're here, this is their home. She began to cry. Ethan went outside. He took out a notebook. He wrote it down. Family, 4. House, 36. Carpenter, 1. Population, 207. By the end of the first month, 492 people were living in Willow Creek. Ethan knew this for sure. He knew everyone's name. He knew who had arrived on the 3rd day and who had arrived on the 20th. He knew that an old man named Harold Watkins had a sore right knee. He knew that 7-year-old May loved sweets but didn't like rice. He knew that Dan Park, the former truck driver, wasn't a relative but just a namesake. All of this was recorded in his notebook. 3 notebooks, actually. The first was general, incoming, outgoing, balance. The second was medical. Hannah filled it out every evening. The third was personal, for his eyes only. It contained the actual inventory figures. 37,800 units of flour, 59,200 units of rice. He started using up the rice, too. Flour alone wasn't enough. Nearly 500 mouths to feed. That was more than he'd anticipated for the first month. The influx didn't stop. Every day, 2, 3, 4 people, sometimes families, sometimes individuals. Once, a group of 12 arrived, former factory workers from somewhere in the West. They'd been walking for a week. Half of them were wounded. Hannah worked until nightfall. Ethan stood beside her, holding a lantern and handing her bandages. He didn't say a word. When the last of the 12 had been bandaged and laid down, Hannah sat down on the floor of the hallway and said she needed an assistant. One person couldn't be the only doctor for 500 residents. Ethan nodded. The next day, he found a woman among the refugees who had worked as a nurse before the breakthrough. He brought her to Hannah. Hannah looked at her. She asked if she knew how to set up an IV. The woman said yes. Hannah said, "Good, sit down, let's get to work." It was the first hiring in Willow, and Ethan wrote it down in his notebook, marking it as hire number 1. 3 days later, what he had both been waiting for and dreading happened. Looters. A group of 15 people, all men, poorly armed, knives, clubs, 2 crossbows. They came to the gate in the afternoon. It was open. Their leader introduced himself as Red. He said he'd heard there was food here. He said he and his men needed food. He said he could take it himself, or they could work something out. Ethan went out to meet him. He looked at the 15 men with knives and clubs. He looked at his 2 guards with shotguns at the gate. He looked at the wall, which wasn't really a wall because 2 trucks don't count as a wall. He knew that right now, behind him, there were 492 people, and of those, at most 40 were men fit for combat. He knew that 15 armed looters were a serious threat. He knew that if a fight broke out, people would die. His people. He made his decision in 3 seconds. He told Red to wait. He went back to City Hall. He opened his inventory. He found the section for summoning tokens. Spearmen of the North. 100 heads, 1 token per head. He had 47. After using 1, he'd have 46 left. He activated the token. The air behind the warehouse by the eastern gate rippled, and 40 men in chainmail, wielding long spears, appeared on the empty plaza, silently, in formation, as if they'd always been standing there. Ethan walked back toward the gate. 40 spearmen marched behind him, in full armor, armed, in silence. Red and his 15 marauders watched this unfold. Red asked who these men were. Ethan replied that they were his mercenaries, the caravan's guards. He said they were from the north. He said there were 100 of them, and this was just the current shift. Red counted the spearmen. Then he looked at Ethan, then at his knives and clubs. He said they'd probably leave. Ethan said that was a good idea, but he offered an alternative. He said that if Red and his men wanted to eat, they could stay, work, get rations, according to the lists, like everyone else. Red looked at him as if he were crazy. Then he looked at the spearmen, then at his own men. 7 out of 15 stayed, including Red. The rest left. Ethan wrote down 7 new names. Population 499. By evening, the spearman was stationed at 4 posts around the town, and Ethan introduced them to the residents as mercenaries from the north, hired for gold. No one asked any questions. The spearmen didn't speak. They didn't speak at all. Ethan noticed this right away. They followed orders. They stood, they patrolled, but they didn't speak. They didn't eat. They didn't sleep. He checked the token's description in the interface. Summoned units. Validity period 30 days or until destroyed. Require no food or rest. Incapable of independent decision-making. 30 days. Then they'll disappear. Ethan wrote the date in his notebook and jotted down a number next to it. 30. Then he crossed it out and wrote next to it, "In a month, we'll need real security, made up of people." Hannah came to see him that evening. She sat down across from him. She was silent. Then she said that the mercenaries weren't breathing. Ethan looked up at her. She said she was a doctor. She knew what a living person looked like. These people in chainmail don't breathe. They don't blink. They don't sweat. Ethan was silent. He was thinking about what to say. She waited. He said it was hard to explain. She said she wasn't asking for an explanation. She said she didn't care who they were or where they came from. Only one thing mattered to her, whether they were a danger to the residents or not. Ethan said no. They answered only to him. In 30 days, they would be gone. Hannah nodded. She stood up. She walked toward the door. She stopped. She turned around. She said that when he was ready to talk, she'd listen. But not until he was ready himself. She left. Ethan sat alone. He thought about how this woman had just witnessed the impossible and reacted as if she were hearing test results, calmly, professionally, with one question: is this dangerous or not? He thought she was the best hire he'd ever made, in both worlds. The following week, Ethan began building a wall, a real one, not 2 truckloads of barbed wire, a wall. The carpenter he'd put up in House 3-6 turned out to be more than just a carpenter. Before the breakthrough, he'd built houses, frame houses, wooden ones. He knew how to set up supports, how to brace the corners, and how to build a foundation from whatever was available. Ethan provided him with workers, 20 men from among the refugees who were healthy enough to work. He gave him tools from the inventory, axes, saws, nails, all from the crafting resources section. A week later, the first section of the wall was standing, 2 meters high, thick logs dug into the ground, tied together with crossbeams, rough but sturdy. Ethan stood there looking at the wall and thought that in the game, this was called a level 1 fortification. In the game, it was built with a single click. Here, it took a week and 20 men with bloodied calluses. He walked over to the carpenter. He asked his name. The carpenter said Tom Reynolds. Ethan shook his hand and said the wall looked good. Tom looked at his hands, then at the wall. He said he'd built better ones, but it would do for the end of the world. By the end of the first month, Willow Creek looked different. The wall enclosed the town on 3 sides. On the fourth side was a hill and a ravine. The gates were now real wooden doors on hinges. The water pump was working. The hospital was working. The warehouse was full. The bakery was open every day. There was a bulletin board in the square. Ethan posted the schedule on it. Distribution times, work times, quiet times. People read the schedule and went where it said. Not because they were afraid, because, for the first time in a year, someone had told them what to do, and its sense. Ethan stood on a hill outside the city and looked down. Smoke from the chimneys, people on the streets, children playing, not hiding, playing. He opened his inventory, checked the supplies, subtracted the consumption. He wrote it down. Flour, 36,200. Consumption had gone up. 500 people eat more than 200. It's simple math. He closed his inventory and looked toward the horizon. Somewhere out there were other cities, other people, other problems. He knew that soon it wouldn't just be refugees who would hear about Willow. Soon, those who don't ask but simply take would find out. He needed an army, a real one, made up of living, breathing people. He needed a farm. He needed an agronomist. He needed allies. He walked down the hill and headed back to town. A new family was standing at the gate, 4 of them. He wrote down their names. April Chen was sitting on her knees in the mud, talking to the ground. Not figuratively. She was literally holding a handful of soil up to her face and muttering something. Ethan stood 10 paces away and watched. He'd found her by chance. He'd gone out through the gate that morning to check the eastern perimeter and saw a small figure in round glasses poking around in the dirt behind the old woman's house. The house stood 200 meters from the wall, half ruined. The roof had caved, but behind the house was a plot of land, small, 20 by 20 meters, and on that plot someone had dug up the soil, haphazardly, not very deep, with bare hands judging by the furrows. Ethan approached. He asked what she was doing. She flinched. She looked up. Small, thin-framed glasses. Her eyes were large and frightened. She said she was trying to plant potatoes. Ethan looked at the ground. He asked if it was working. She shook her head. She said the system had marked the soil as a depleted resource. Nothing grows there. She'd tried 3 times. Sprouts appear and die immediately, as if the earth is rejecting them. Ethan crouched down beside her. He opened the interface. He looked at the ground through the system filter. She was right. The soil glowed a dull gray. Status, depleted resource, level 0. Requirements for activation: clear the area of hostile entities within a 1-kilometer radius. Restoration ritual. Seeds of base rank or higher. He read the conditions and thought, clear the area. That meant killing all monsters within a kilometer. Restoration ritual. It was a game quest. He remembered it. In Kingdom of Ash Online, it was called Awakening of the Earth. You had to stand in the center of the area and activate the item Blessed Fertilizer. He checked his inventory. Blessed Fertilizer, 120 units. He'd bought it 3 years ago at the fall event, never used it, thought it was useless junk. He looked at April. She was sitting in the mud, waiting. A small, quiet girl with glasses who'd come to visit her grandmother for vacation and got stuck at the end of the world. He asked her name. She said April Chen. He asked who she was before the breakthrough. She said she was a student, University of California, Department of Agronomy, Junior. Ethan froze. He looked at her, then at the dug-up plot, then back at her. He said he needed a farm, a big one, a real one that would feed the city. He asked if she could do it. April blinked. Then she blinked again. She said she had no seeds, no tools, no people, and the soil wouldn't accept the crops. Ethan said he had seeds, tools too. He'd provide the people, and he'd figure out the land. April looked at him confused. She asked who he even was. Ethan replied that he was the manager. She asked, "Manager of what?" He said he didn't know yet, but he'd find out soon. By evening that day, Ethan had assembled a group. Red, a former looter, Tom, a carpenter, 6 burly men from among the refugees, 8 people in all. He led them out through the gate and explained the mission. They needed to clear the area within a kilometer radius of the eastern section, kill all the mobs. According to the interface, low-level creatures were found there. Goblins, levels 3 through 5, in groups of 3 or 4. For a level 100 player, they were mere bugs. For 8 men with axes and spears, they were a deadly threat. Ethan knew this. That's why he set a condition. 6 spearmen from the summoned squad would go with them. They would serve as the vanguard. The men would finish them off. Red looked at him and asked why make things so complicated. Ethan said he needed land. Red said there was plenty of land all around. Ethan said he needed living land. Red didn't understand, but he nodded. The sweep took 3 days, 4 skirmishes with groups of goblins. The spearmen took the brunt of the attack. They felt no pain. They didn't retreat. They weren't afraid, because they weren't alive. Red watched them and said nothing. After the 3rd skirmish, he walked over to Ethan and quietly remarked that these mercenaries were strange. Ethan replied that all mercenaries were strange. Red said these ones didn't eat. Ethan replied that it was included in the contract, full board. They just weren't hungry. Red looked at him for a long time. Then he turned away and went to sharpen his axe. When the last goblin fell and disintegrated into system sparks, Ethan was standing in the center of the plot behind Grandma's house. He pulled out of the storeroom a small bag of blessed fertilizer. Green, glowing, utterly surreal against the backdrop of the dirty earth and the gray sky. He poured the contents onto the ground. The earth trembled. Not metaphorically. He felt it through his feet. A faint tremor, like a pulse. The gray color of the soil based to change, slowly. Dark gray turned to just gray. Gray turned to brown. Brown turned dark and damp. The system panel lit up. Territory, Eastern Plot. Status, restored. Level 1. Available crops, basic wheat, basic rye, basic barley, basic potatoes. April stood nearby. She looked at the ground. Then she knelt down. She scooped up a handful, brought it to her face, and she began to cry. Quietly, silently. Ethan didn't ask why. He knew why. Because the soil smelled like soil. Alive. He took a small bag of seeds from his inventory. Wheat. He placed it in front of her. She took it with both hands, pressed it to her chest. Ethan said the plot was small, 20 by 20 meters, but it was a start. Every cleared square meter of land could be restored. He had fertilizer. She had knowledge. Together, they could sow the field. April looked up at him. Her eyes were red, wet. She said she needed people, at least 5 people who would do whatever she told them to do. No questions asked. No jokes about the girl with the garden. Ethan said she'd get 10, and that if any of them made even one joke about the girl with the garden, he'd personally transfer that person to the night shift at the cesspool. For the first time during the conversation, April smiled. A small, quick smile. And she hid it right away. 2 days later, 12 people were working on the Eastern Plot. April walked among them and spoke in a quiet voice that, for some reason, everyone could hear. Deeper, more even. The distance between the rows was 30 centimeters. Not 20, not 40, 30. She knew what she was doing. Ethan stood at the edge of the plot and watched as the people who had been starving to death a month ago were now planting seeds in the ground. He thought this was the most important moment since he'd arrived here. More important than flour. More important than the wall. More important than the spearmen. Because flour from the stockpile is a cheat, but grain in the ground is the future. That evening, he sat with Hannah at the hospital. She was bandaging his hand. He'd cut himself while helping unload logs for the wall. It wasn't deep, but Hannah insisted. She said that an infection doesn't care how deep the cut is. While she was working, he asked how many patients she had right now. She said 11. 3 in serious condition, 2 in moderate condition, 6 with minor injuries. He asked if she was managing. She said no. She said she needed a second doctor, not a nurse, a doctor, someone who knows how to operate. She said that last week they brought in a boy with a fracture, an open one, with the bones sticking out. She set it in 3 hours, all by herself, by candlelight. The boy survived. But she said that if there were another case like that, she wasn't sure she could handle it again. Ethan was silent. He made a mental note. Need a surgeon, high priority. Hannah finished dressing the wound. Then she said she wanted to ask him something. He said he was listening. She asked how long his caravans would last. He didn't answer right away. She waited. He said, not forever. She nodded. She said that's what she thought. Then she said that's exactly why he's building the farm. He said yes. She said, all right then, let's get to work. Ethan left the hospital. The night was cold. He stood on the porch and looked at the stars. The stars here were different, too bright, too uniform, like dots on a render. He thought this world was beautiful, in its own way, if you didn't think about the fact that it kills people every day. He thought about how, in 26 days, the spearmen would disappear, and that by then, he needed to have a plan, a real defense plan, made up of people who breathe, who need to be paid, who need to be fed, and who might get scared and run away. He went back to City Hall. He opened his notebook, and he began to write the plan. On the 40th day, a woman in a torn dress with a single earring arrived in Willow Creek. The guard at the gate registered her as a refugee. First name, Eleanor. Last name, refused to give it. Age, 23. Occupation, not specified. Ethan reviewed the records of new arrivals every morning. He paused at this entry. Eleanor, no last name, 23, no occupation. He asked the guard to describe her. The guard said she was tall, thin, light hair, straight back, carries herself as if the whole world owed her something, speaks softly but in a way that makes you want to listen. Ethan set the notebook aside, straight back. In a world where people sleep on the floor for months and hunch over from hunger, a straight back isn't a habit. It's a matter of upbringing. He found her at the communal dining hall. She was sitting alone at the farthest table. A bowl of porridge stood before her. She was eating slowly, with a small spoon. Her back was straight. Her elbows weren't on the table, not even here. Even over a bowl of buckwheat at the end of the world. Ethan sat down across from her. He introduced himself. He said he was the governor of this city. She looked up. Her eyes were gray, cold, very tired. She said she was pleased to meet him, in an even, polite tone, as if they were at a reception rather than in a former school cafeteria. Ethan asked where she was from. She said from the West. He asked where exactly. She didn't answer. He looked at the earring in her left ear, silver, delicate work, a small coat of arms. He'd seen that coat of arms, in the game. House Lancaster, the clan, one of the 3 largest. He knew their symbols, a lion and a tower. The earring had a lion and a tower on it. He didn't say a word. He finished his porridge, got up, said that if she needed a job, she should come to City Hall tomorrow morning. She looked at him. She tilted her head slightly. She said, all right. The next day she came, at 8 o'clock sharp. Ethan was waiting. He set tea on the table, real tea, from the stock, green tea in a porcelain cup. It was the only porcelain in all of Willow, and he'd brought it out especially for her. Eleanor sat down. She looked at the cup, then at him. Something in her eyes changed. She said she hadn't drunk from porcelain in a long time. Ethan said he knew who she was. He called her by her full name, Eleanor Lancaster, the youngest daughter of Arthur Lancaster, head of the House of Lancaster, London. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. Only her fingers on the cup turned slightly white. She asked how he knew. He said it was the coat of arms on her earring. She touched her ear mechanically, then lowered her hand. She said she'd sold the other earring to pay for her fare. Ethan said he understood. He said it didn't matter to him where she'd fled from or why. What mattered to him was that she was here and that she was capable. He said he needed someone who understood clan politics, someone who knew the names, the connections, and the debts, someone who could read a letter from an enemy diplomat and understand what was really as written between the lines. He offered her the position of chief of staff. Eleanor was silent. She sipped her tea in small sips. Then she set her cup down. She said that he was either very smart or very naive. Ethan said that most likely he was both. She asked why he trusted her. He said he didn't trust her, but he needed someone who knew the enemy from the inside. And she had fled from the enemy, so they had a common interest. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that her father had wanted to marry her off to Lord Cross, the commander of the Northern Wing. She was 22. Lord Cross was 48. He beat his first wife, his second too. His third hanged herself. Eleanor told her father no. Her father said it wasn't up for discussion. She ran away at night, with one earring and the dress she was wearing. She walked for 2 months. Ethan listened in silence. When she finished, he said one thing. He said that here, no one would ever tell her that it wasn't a question. Here, every question is a question. She blinked, quickly, as if something had gotten in her eye. Then she straightened up even more and said that she'd take the position, and that she needed a desk, paper, ink, and a map. Ethan gave her everything. The map was his own, drawn by hand on a large sheet of paper, rough, inaccurate. Eleanor looked at it for 2 minutes. Then she picked up a quill and began to correct it. Here, it's not a river, but a stream. Here, the Iron Throne's border runs 30 kilometers further east. Here stands a Crimson Dawn outpost he didn't know about. She worked for 3 hours. When she finished, the map looked like an official document, not like a sketch. Ethan looked at it and thought he'd just acquired a weapon more powerful than 40 spearmen. 2 days later, Eleanor came to him with a report, her first. She said that Willow was in a dangerous position. The city lies at the intersection of 3 spheres of influence. To the east is the Iron Throne. To the south is the Crimson Dawn Guild. To the west is House Lancaster. As long as the city remains small and inconspicuous, all 3 ignore it. But population growth and rumors of bread will soon attract attention. Spies will be the first to find out. All 3 clans have spy networks. She knows this because she's read her father's spy reports herself. Eleanor said they have about 2 or 3 months of peace, maybe 4 if they're lucky. Then one of the clans will send a scout. And depending on what the scout sees, the next move will be either a diplomat or an army. Ethan asked what to do. She looked at him calmly and said they needed a cover story. A history, an explanation of why this city exists and where its resources come from. A story that would be plausible enough for a spy to believe and boring enough that the clan wouldn't want to interfere. Ethan thought for a moment. Then he said he was a merchant. He had a trading company, caravans, connections. Eleanor shook her head. She said that a caravan without a road and without guards doesn't exist. Any scout would check the route and find no traces. We need a different story. Ethan asked what kind. Eleanor said that the best lie is a half-truth. He's a merchant, that's obvious. He knows how to count, that's clear. But a single merchant can't support an entire city. So there must be someone backing him. Let there be. Let the spy think that an old lineage stands behind this city, an ancient family of merchants with stockpiles from before the war. She'll create the documents, letters, seals, a history that never existed. She can do it because she did it for her father. Ethan looked at her. A 23-year-old girl in a torn dress sat before him and proposed creating a fictitious aristocracy from scratch, with seals and a family tree. He said he liked the idea. She said that in that case, she'd need more paper and sealing wax. Ethan nodded. He took a roll of parchment and 3 sticks of sealing wax from the supplies, red ones. Eleanor looked at the sealing wax, then at him. She said quietly that he had some very interesting caravans, ones that transported red sealing wax in the midst of the apocalypse. Ethan didn't reply. She didn't wait for an answer. She took the sealing wax and went to work. A week later, there was a folder on Ethan's desk. Inside was a complete backstory. The Willow Trading Company, founded 3 generations ago by the Park family. Specialization, food supply. Warehouses in the mountains. Pre-war stockpiles. 3 forged letters from non-existent partners. 2 seals. 1 official seal. Eleanor had done it all in 7 days. Ethan read it and thought that this girl was worth more as chancellor than an entire army. He asked Eleanor if there was anything she wanted for herself. Not for the city, for herself. She fell silent for a long time. Then she said she wanted someone to ask her opinion, not as a tool, not as her father's daughter, as a person. Ethan said he had a meeting in an hour to discuss grain distribution for the coming month. 3 options. He wanted to know what she thought. Which of the 3 was the right one? She looked at him. He saw her lips tremble slightly. She said she'd need 10 minutes to look over the numbers. He said she had 15. At the meeting, Ethan presented the 3 plans. Eleanor listened in silence. Then she raised her hand. She said all 3 were wrong. She proposed a 4th, with a rationale, with figures. Ethan looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at Eleanor, then at Ethan. She nodded. Ethan said they were adopting the 4th plan. Eleanor sat up straight, as always, but her right hand was trembling slightly under the table. Winter in the 2nd year struck earlier than expected. The first snow fell in early October and never melted. The temperature had dropped to -20 in a single week. Willow Creek stood white and silent. 22,000 people behind the walls, smoke rising from every chimney, a 3-month supply of firewood, a 4-month supply of grain. Ethan sat in headquarters and looked at the numbers. The inventory showed 12,000 units of flour, 14,000 of rice, 190,000 of gold. 31 conscription tokens remained. Over the past year and a half, he had used 16 tokens. Each time, he felt as if the hourglass were losing another handful of sand. But the most important thing wasn't the inventory. The most important thing lay in April's report. She'd brought it that morning, 12 pages, in small handwriting. The results of the first full harvest. 3 fields, total area 90 hectares, reclaimed land, wheat, rye, potatoes. The harvest totaled 700 metric tons of grain and 300 metric tons of potatoes. April had written a single line at the bottom. Given the current population and consumption rates, this would be enough for 5 months of self-sufficient food supply without drawing on external reserves. Ethan read that line 4 times. 5 months. Not 12, not a full year. 5. That meant Willow was still dependent on his supplies, but a year and a half ago that dependence had been 100%. Now it had dropped to 60%. The curve was going down, slowly, but it was going down. He closed the report and looked out the window. In the square, Martha was directing a crew that was reinforcing the roofs. Her voice could be heard through the double-paned glass. She was cursing in 4 languages and waving a blueprint. Standing next to her was her eldest son, 12 years old, holding a box of nails. Her youngest son sat on the porch, drawing something in the snow with a stick. Marta had built more this past year than Ethan could have imagined. Barracks for the militia, a school with 200 seats, a second bakery, a workshop, a bathhouse, a water line from the spring to the central square, clay pipes, crooked, leaking at every joint. But they worked. She said that perfection was the enemy. Ethan agreed with her. He stepped outside. The cold hit him in the face. He pulled up his hood and walked toward the south gate. Eleanor was waiting for him there. She was standing against the wall with a folder pressed to her chest. Next to her stood a man Ethan was seeing for the first time. Short, stocky, wearing an expensive fur coat, a sword at his belt, a symbol on his chest, an iron fist on a red background. The Iron Throne. Eleanor introduced him, the ambassador of the Iron Throne. His name was Boris Kren. He was authorized to conduct negotiations on behalf of Lord Commander Dmitry Volkov. Ethan took note of the surname. Volkov, just like Martha. He didn't let it show. He shook the ambassador's hand, invited him to headquarters. Ambassador Kren proved to be a professional. He didn't make threats. He didn't pressure them. He spoke calmly and politely. He said that the Iron Throne was interested in a trade partnership with Willow, that the Lord Commander was impressed that such a small city had managed to achieve such prosperity, that the Iron Throne was ready to offer protection, military protection, against all external threats in exchange for the exclusive right to purchase grain at a fixed price. Ethan listened. He nodded. He took notes. Then he asked what the price was. The ambassador named a figure. Ethan's expression didn't change. The price was 3 times lower than the market rate. This wasn't trade. It was a tribute. He said he'd think it over. The ambassador said he had a week. Then he stood up and left. Eleanor closed the door behind him. She turned to Ethan. She said quietly that a week wasn't time to think it over. It was an ultimatum. Ethan nodded. He knew. He asked what she thought. Eleanor sat down. She spread a map out on the table. She showed the Iron Throne's troop dispositions. 3 garrisons to the east, a total strength of about 5,000 players, average level 40 to 50, commanders at level 60 and above. Opposing them, Willow had a militia of 800 men, of whom 120 were players. Average level 25. The math was brutal. Eleanor said a direct confrontation was impossible. Ethan said he had no intention of trying one. He called a meeting. Hannah, Eleanor, J.A., Martha, April, Leah, Red, Tom, the mayor. 9 people in a cramped room. Ethan laid out the situation. The Iron Throne wants to control Willow, not destroy it, control it. That means they don't want to storm the city. An assault would destroy what they came for. They want Willow to open the gates on its own, voluntarily, under pressure. Eleanor added that, to her knowledge, Dmitry Volkov, the Iron Throne's Lord Commander, is no fool. He's a former general. He won't waste soldiers on an assault if he can strangle the city economically, block trade routes, intercept caravans from neighboring communities, cut them off from their allies, starve the city. And when the people start to leave, simply walk through the empty gates. Ethan listened. Then he turned to Martha. He asked how many days it would take her to reinforce the wall to siege-proof standards. Martha said 3 weeks, if she were given the manpower. Ethan turned to Red. He asked how many days it would take him to train another 200 militiamen. Red said a month at a basic level. Ethan turned to April. He asked how much food they could stockpile if they started canning potatoes right away. April said that with the workshop running at full capacity, they could prepare enough food to last 3 months' worth of food in addition to their current reserves. Ethan turned to J.A. She was standing against the wall with her arms crossed, her sword on her back. He asked how many players in Willow were ready to fight. She said 120, 40 of whom were above level 30. 12 are above level 40. She herself is level 58. She'd gained 11 levels in a year. Ethan nodded. Then he looked at Leah. She was sitting in the corner with a guitar on her lap. He asked what she thought. Leah said that people were afraid. Rumors about what was to come had already spread. She'd heard conversations in the square. People say that if the Iron Throne comes, we should surrender, that resistance is futile, that it's better to live under the clan's rule than to die free. Ethan was silent. Then he said he understood their fear. He said he wouldn't force anyone. Whoever wants to leave will be free to go with provisions for the journey, but he himself won't leave, and he won't surrender the city. Not because he's brave, but because he knows one thing. The Iron Throne doesn't want a partnership. The Iron Throne wants resources. And once the city becomes a resource, the people will become expendable. He'd seen it, in the game and in life. He asked if there were any questions. Hannah raised her hand. She said she didn't have a question. She had a request. She asked him to eat. He hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Everyone laughed. Ethan, too. The meeting ended. 3 days later, Ethan gave the ambassador his answer. He said that Willow thanked the Iron Throne for the offer, and she was declining. The price wasn't right. The terms weren't right. Willow was willing to negotiate on equal terms at market price without exclusivity. The ambassador looked at him for a long time. Then he said that Ethan was making a mistake. Ethan replied that perhaps he was, but it was his mistake. The ambassador left. Eleanor stood next to Ethan and watched as the ambassador's convoy disappeared over the horizon. She said quietly that now it would begin. Ethan said he knew. He turned and walked to headquarters. He had a lot of work to do. The blockade began 2 weeks after the ambassador's departure. Quietly, without warning, the caravans simply stopped coming. The 3 communities with which Willow traded grain and iron fell silent all at once. Ethan sent out scouts. 2 returned after a day. The 3rd did not return. The 2 who returned said the same thing. Iron Throne patrols were stationed on all the roads leading to Willow. Not an army, patrols. 5 or 6 players at every crossroads. They don't attack, they just stand there. And every caravan heading for Willow receives a polite suggestion to turn back. Eleanor said this was a classic tactic, a soft blockade. Technically, there's no war. No one is attacking anyone. The city is simply slowly suffocating. Ethan opened his notebook. He tallied the supplies. Taking into account their own harvest and supplies, the town could hold out for 7 months. That's a long time, but the people didn't know that. They saw that the caravans weren't coming, and panic grew every day. On the 3rd day of the blockade, a crowd gathered in the square, about 300 people. They weren't shouting, they were just standing there, waiting. Ethan went out to them. He stood on the steps of City Hall. He said he knew about the blockade. He said the supplies would last for many months. He said no one would go hungry. He said this calmly, as a matter of fact. The crowd listened. Someone shouted from the back rows that the Iron Throne was stronger, that they needed to negotiate. Ethan replied that he had tried to negotiate. The price of the agreement was their freedom. He asked if anyone was satisfied with that price. The crowd fell silent. Then a woman in the front row said no. She wasn't satisfied. She was one of the first refugees, one of those who had arrived when the city had a population of 300. She remembered the smell of the first loaf of bread. The crowd gradually dispersed. But Ethan knew that words were only a temporary remedy. He needed action. He returned to headquarters and unfolded a map. Eleanor and J.A. were already waiting. He said that the blockade wasn't just a problem, it was a message. The Iron Throne is telling the world that Willow is weak, that he can be strangled, that he is alone. So the response must be just as loud. We need to break through the blockade, not by force, by cunning. Eleanor proposed a plan. Willow had 4 allied communities, small ones, intimidated by the blockade, but still loyal. If Willow sent a convoy of grain and gold to each of them, it would show that the blockade wasn't working. The problem was the patrols. 5 or 6 players at levels 40, 50 at every intersection. A regular convoy wouldn't get through. G.A. said she would get through. Ethan looked at her. She was standing by the wall, arms crossed. Level 58, Northern Blade. She said she'd take the 10 best players from the militia with her, at night, through the woods, past the patrols. If she has to fight, she'll handle it. 6 against 1, that's not fair to G.A., for the 6 of them. Ethan said no. She looked at him. He said he didn't want her to fight. She'll take the convoy and get it through quietly, no fighting. If she sees a patrol, she'll go around it. If she can't go around it, she'll wait. G.A. grimaced. She said it was boring. Ethan said that keeping G.A. alive was more important than an exciting fight. She turned away, but he saw her shoulders tremble. She wasn't used to anyone worrying about her. The first convoy set out that same night. G.A. and 10 players, 4 wagons of grain. They traveled along forest trails that Red knew from his days as a marauder. 2 days later, a message arrived. The convoy had made it. The Riverbend community had received the grain. Ethan exhaled. The second convoy set out 3 days later. It made it too. The third. The fourth. In 2 weeks, Willow had broken through the blockade 4 times. Not with an army, with wagons full of grain. The Iron Throne stepped up its patrols, and Ethan changed the routes. Through her contacts, Eleanor found 2 more passages that weren't marked on the maps. It was a war of nerves, silent, invisible, not a single casualty. But the Iron Throne was losing face every day. Their blockade wasn't working. The small town behind the wall continued to feed the Allies. In the 4th week of the blockade, what Ethan had been waiting for happened. People arrived at the gates of Willow, not refugees, deserters. 12 players from the Iron Throne garrison. Their commander explained it simply. They hadn't been paid for 3 months. The food at the garrison was terrible, discipline was brutal. But in Willow, the air smelled of bread. Ethan took them in. He wrote down their names, levels, and specializations. 12 players, average level 35. They were more than just soldiers. They were a signal. The Iron Throne was losing people. Eleanor said this was just the beginning. She said that in any blockade, both sides suffer. The Iron Throne's garrisons stand out in the cold. They eat rations. They wait for orders. There are no orders. Because an assault means destruction, and destruction means the loss of the resource for which they had embarked on this venture in the first place. The Iron Throne had fallen into the trap of its own strategy. Ethan nodded. He was already thinking about the next move. Not defense, an attack. Not a military one, an economic one. He convened a council. He laid out on the table the documents he'd been preparing for the past 3 months. A plan for a trade union. 7 communities, uniform prices, a single currency, mutual defense, a single market. Eleanor had drafted the agreement, 12 pages. Hannah had reviewed the medical protocols. April had calculated the seed shipments. Martha prepared a plan for building roads between the communities. Ethan looked at the table piled high with papers. Then he looked at his people. 6 women. Red, Tom, the mayor. He said that when the blockade ended, and it would end, they had to be ready. Not just to survive, to grow, to become too big to be stifled. In the 6th week of the blockade, the Iron Throne withdrew its patrols, without warning, just as quietly as it had deployed them. Ethan learned of this from his scouts that morning. The roads were clear. He didn't celebrate. He knew this wasn't a victory. It was a lull. The Iron Throne was regrouping. It would come up with a new move. But for now, right now, the roads are clear, and on Ethan's desk lay the treaty for a trade alliance among the 7 cities. A week later, he signed it with representatives from all 7 communities, in Willow Square, in front of witnesses. Eleanor read the terms aloud. Ethan signed it, with gold ink that Leah had found somewhere in the storeroom. Leah sang, something new, without words, just a melody. People stood in the square and listened. 22,000 in Willow and delegations from the 7 cities. Ethan stood on the steps of City Hall with a quill in his hand and thought that this wasn't a cheat, not an item, not a draft token. This was real. He looked at his signature. Ethan Pack, Administrator. And for the first time, he thought that maybe this class wasn't a trick by the system. Maybe it was exactly what it said it was. Spring of the 2nd year arrived with rains. The snow melted quickly, the rivers swelled, the roads turned to mud. But April's fields had survived the winter. She stood knee-deep in the wet earth, touching the sprouts pushing through the black soil. 200 hectares, 3 times more than a year ago. Wheat, row wheat, potatoes, barley, peas. She counted every sprout. Ethan stood nearby and watched. He didn't know much about agronomy, but he saw how April looked at the field, as if it were a child who had finally found its feet. He asked what the forecast was. She said that if the summer was normal, the fall harvest would cover 80% of the needs of Willow and the allied towns. 80%. Ethan jotted down the figure. A year ago, it was 60. In a year, it would be 100. Maybe, if nothing happened. He knew something would happen. Something always happens. And it happened in mid-April. Victor Sterling sent an invitation, a personal one, addressed to Ethan Pack, manager of the Willow Trading Company. Gold letters on black parchment, the seal of the Crimson Dawn Guild. An invitation to a business lunch in the neutral city of Crossroads in 10 days. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she set it down on the table and said it was a trap, or an opportunity, or both. Victor Sterling, former CEO of a hedge fund, head of the Crimson Dawn Guild, controls the territory of former Beijing and everything within a 500-kilometer radius. 8,000 players, 200,000 ordinaries. The largest military force on the continent after the Iron Throne. The very same man who, 6 months ago, sent 2,000 players to lay siege to Willow. A siege that Ethan won without a single summoned soldier. Thanks to Martha's engineering traps, Eleanor's intelligence, Jia's sword, and the betrayal within the enemy camp that he had orchestrated long before the siege through agents Eleanor had planted back in the summer. Victor lost 300 players and retreated. It was a humiliation. And now he was inviting Ethan to dinner. Ethan said he'd go. Eleanor said it was madness. Jia said she'd go with him. Ethan said he'd go alone. Jia said that in that case, she'd go separately and sit in the neighboring tavern with his sword on her lap. Ethan looked at her. She stood straight, her jaw clenched. Her eyes didn't blink. He said, "All right." Crossroads turned out to be a small town at the intersection of 3 roads. Neutral territory. No one's territory. A tavern in the center. Stone walls, candles. A private room on the 2nd floor. A table for 2. Ethan entered first. Victor Sterling was already waiting. Tall, thin, black hair with gray at the temples. A suit. A real suit. A 3-piece. In a world where people wore chainmail and tattered jackets, this man wore a suit. He stood up and extended his hand. The handshake was firm, businesslike. They sat down. Sterling poured some wine. Ethan didn't drink. He took some water. Sterling wasn't offended. He said he was impressed, that Willow was the best startup in the world. He used that exact word, startup. Ethan looked at him and realized that sitting across from him was a man who thought just like he did. Systems, metrics, cycles. Only in Victor's spreadsheet, people were units, a column with a number, no names. They talked for 3 hours, about grain logistics, about iron prices, about routes, about mobs on the roads, about how the system allocates resources. Victor knew a lot. He knew the economics of this world better than any clan. He understood the mechanics. He saw the patterns. He said that in 2 years, food would run out everywhere, that the system was gradually increasing the difficulty, that the mobs were getting stronger, that territories that don't develop will be blocked off. He said the only way to survive is to unite, under one leader, with a single economy, with a single army. He said he was proposing an alliance, Crimson Dawn and Willow, together. Ethan asked on what terms. Victor said on equal footing. 2 voices, 2 councils, a single budget. Ethan looked him in the eye. Victor didn't look away. He was convincing. Perfectly convincing. Like a presentation to investors. Ethan asked one thing. He asked what had happened to the village of Oakdale. Victor's expression didn't change. He asked which village. Ethan said that 3 months ago, the village of Oakdale had refused to pay tribute to Crimson Dawn. 200 residents. A week later, the village burned to the ground. 40 people survived. They came to Willow. Ethan had written down their names. He remembered every one of them. Victor remained silent. Then he said it was the work of local bandits, not his people. Ethan said the survivors had recognized the Crimson Dawn insignia on the armor. Victor said the insignia could have been forged. Ethan didn't argue. He finished his water. He stood up. He said he appreciated the meal, and that an alliance on equal terms was impossible with a man who burns down villages. Victor stood up too. He smiled. He said Ethan was an idealist, that idealists don't survive. Ethan said he was surviving for now. Victor said, "For now?" Ethan left. J.A. was waiting for him on the stairs. She stood with her sword at the ready. He shook his head. No need. They rode back in silence. An hour later, J.A. said she didn't like Victor. Ethan said he didn't either. She asked why. He said it was because Victor was just like him, only without the grandmother who used to cook ribs on Wednesdays. J.A. didn't get it. He didn't bother to explain. When they got back to Willow, Ethan locked himself in the headquarters. He sat poring over the map and thinking. Victor had said one thing that was true. The system was increasing the difficulty. The mobs were getting stronger. He checked. Over the past month, the level of monsters in the wilderness around Willow had risen by 3 points. A month ago, the average level was 12. Now it was level 15. It was a trend. In a year, the average mob would be level 30. In 2 years, level 50. The Willow militia wouldn't be able to handle that. He needed strong players, lots of them. He needed allies, real ones, not business partners, military. And he needed to understand why the system does what it does, who's behind it, who's increasing the difficulty, and why. He opened the interface, and for the first time in a year and a half, he carefully read the description of his class. Controller. Unique. Created by the administrator. He reread the last word. Created by the administrator. Not by the system, by the administrator. Someone had created this class, personally, for him. He closed the interface, looked up at the ceiling, and thought it was time to look for answers. The summer of his second year was hot and long. The fields of April were turning golden. 200 hectares of wheat swayed in the wind, and Ethan stood on the wall and looked at them every morning. It was a ritual. 5 minutes of silence, then back to headquarters. War awaited him at headquarters, not with people, with the system. After meeting with Victor, he began digging deeper. Every evening after meetings and debriefings, he would sit alone and scroll through the interface. He was looking for anomalies, inconsistencies, bugs, and he found them. The first anomaly, the Awakening of the Earth quest, which he had used to restore the soil, did not exist in the system's quest database. He checked. Regular players couldn't see this quest. It was available only to him, as if someone had added it to the game on purpose. The second anomaly, his inventory. He compared the list of items with his old account in Kingdom of Ash online. 90% matched, but 10% were new, items he had never purchased. Blessed fertilizer. He thought he'd bought it at an event, but now, as he tried to recall it clearly, he couldn't find that event in his memory. It was as if the memory had been implanted. The third anomaly, Victor Sterling. Ethan asked Eleanor to gather everything she could find out about the leaders of the largest clans. She worked on it for a month. The results were in a folder on his desk. 7 names, 7 leaders, 7 unique classes. Victor Sterling, class strategist, unique. Dmitry Volkov of the Iron Throne, class unique. Arthur Lancaster of House Lancaster, class sovereign, unique. 4 more in other parts of the world, each with a unique class, each leading a major faction. 7 unique classes, 7 leaders, including him. Ethan sat and stared at the list. 7 finalists. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a selection process. He thought back to Kingdom of Ash Online. 30,000 players, years of tournaments, years of running guilds, years of observation. Someone had been watching them, all of them, and had chosen 7. Those who know how to lead, those who build systems, those who guide people. The breach wasn't a catastrophe. The breach was the final test. He told only Hannah about it, at night, in the hospital, when everyone had left. He sat on the edge of the couch and spoke softly. He said that the world of Ash wasn't a coincidence, that someone had created it intentionally, that this someone is watching, that he has administrator access, that the system obeys him. Hannah listened in silence. Then she asked what that meant for Willow. Ethan said it meant the rules of the game could change at any moment, that the difficulty would increase, that at some point, no city would be able to survive on its own, that this is exactly what the administrator wants, to force everyone to unite, or to destroy one another. Only one model will survive. Hannah asked what model Victor had. Ethan said an empire, a rigid hierarchy, one leader, everyone obeys, efficient, fast, brutal. Hannah asked what model he had. Ethan said a republic, horizontal, many voices, slow, complicated, but stable. Because when a leader dies, an empire collapses, but a republic carries on. Hannah was silent. Then she said she liked his model, but as a doctor, she wanted to point out one thing. The model doesn't work if its creator hasn't slept for 3 nights in a row. Ethan smirked. She wasn't joking. At the end of summer, 2 events occurred. First, the system issued a global announcement. To all players on the planet, blue text filling the entire screen. Attention! In 6 months, the event will be activated. The Great Storm. All territories 1 level below level 3 will be attacked by a wave of maximum rank mobs. Recommendation: unite or perish. Ethan read this while standing on a wall. Eleanor and J.A. were standing nearby. Eleanor said this was the end, for small communities, for individual cities, for anyone not part of a major alliance. J.A. said that the maximum mob rank was level 80 and above. No city except for the 3 largest clans would be able to withstand such a wave. Ethan was silent. He was thinking. The great storm in 6 months. It was a move by the administrator. Pressure, coercion to unite, under someone's banner, under Victor's, or Dimitri's, or Arthur's, or under his own. The second event occurred that same evening. The system interface flashed a new line right in front of him, one that hadn't been there before. Player Ethan _Park. The administrator wants to speak with you. Ethan was standing on the wall. His people were nearby. Hannah with a tablet, Eleanor with a folder, J.A. with a sword, Martha with blueprints. April with a handful of grain from the new harvest, Leah with a guitar. Down below in the square, children were flying paper kites, the first paper kites since the day of the breakthrough. Ethan read the line. He closed it without a word. He watched the kites for a minute, the children, the fields beyond the wall, the smoke rising from the chimneys. Then he turned to his group. He said, "Looks like we have a meeting with a stakeholder. Let's get going." Leah was the first to laugh. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. J.A. placed her hand on her sword. Hannah pulled a sandwich out of her pocket and silently slipped it into his hand. Martha said that if the stakeholder wants to talk, let it come to them. She's got a construction site. Ethan took a bite of the sandwich. He looked at the message again. Then he pressed reply. He wrote a single sentence. Name the time and place. The reply came instantly. The Tower of Ash, the center of the continent. In 30 days. Come without an army. Ethan showed the reply to Eleanor. She read it. She said that the Tower of Ash was a ruin in the center of the map, a former skyscraper, the highest point on the continent. No one goes there because it are mobs of level 70 and higher. Ethan said that meant they needed a way through. Eleanor said a way through could be found if you knew where to look. Ethan said, "All right, we have 30 days." Eleanor nodded and opened a folder. The work began. They set out on the 20th day. Ethan, Hannah, Eleanor, J.A., Martha, April, Leah. 7 people. No army. Just as they'd been told. A crowd had gathered at the Willow Gate. 30,000 people. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving flags. They were just standing there. The mayor approached Ethan and shook his hand. Then he hugged him. Then he let go. Red stood nearby with a sword at his belt. He said he would wait. Ethan said he knew. Tom, the carpenter, said the walls would hold. Ethan said he had no doubt. They walked out through the gates. Eleanor led the way. She found a route, through a mountain pass, along the bed of a dry river, past the ruins of the old city. A 10-day journey, through territory where mobs were level 50 and above. G.A. walked ahead, sword in hand. She was level 60 now. In 2 years in Willow, she'd leveled up 13 times. Not because she fought a lot, it was because she trained every day. In the morning before dawn, in the evening after dinner, alone on the training ground behind the barracks. Ethan knew this because Hannah had complained that Gia would show up for her medical checkup with her knuckles scraped raw. The first skirmish happened on the 3rd day. A group of ogres, 4 of them, level 52. Gia stepped forward. Ethan wanted to tell her to be careful. He didn't have time. She moved so fast that all he saw was a streak of light. The sword flashed. Once. Twice. 3 times. 4 times. 4 ogres fell. Gia turned around. She didn't have a single scratch on her. "Boring," she said. Martha remarked that young people these days were ill-mannered. Everyone laughed, except the ogres. They were moving fast. Eleanor knew the map by heart, every turn, every ravine, every spot where they could take cover. Hannah kept an eye on the group's health. She made everyone drink water, eat on time, and rest. Ethan noticed that Hannah had stopped counting the casualties. 2 years ago, when she first came to Willow, she used to count the dead. Now, she counted the living. He didn't tell her that, but he noticed. April walked in silence. In her backpack lay a folder of reports: crop yields, acreage, forecasts, soil data. Ethan asked why she'd brought it along. She said that if the administrator wanted to talk, he should see what they'd built. Not walls, not an army. Fields. Ethan looked at her, small, quiet, wearing round glasses, with a handful of grain in her pocket. He thought she was right. Leah was carrying her guitar, as always, just like 2 years ago when she arrived in Willow. In the evenings, she would play, quietly, by the campfire, without words, just a melody. And every evening, Ethan would fall asleep to that melody and think that for the sake of that sound, it was worth dying in Seattle Bay and waking up in a strange world. On the 7th day, Leah sat down next to him by the campfire. Everyone else was already asleep, except for Ji-ah, who was standing guard. Leah said quietly that she wanted to ask him something. He said he was listening. She asked if he was afraid. He said yes. She asked of what. He said he was afraid that the administrator might be right, that the world could only survive under a single leader, that a republic was a beautiful dream that didn't work when dragons flew overhead. Def was silent. Then she said that a dream works if people believe in it. And people believe because every Wednesday, Ji-ah has braised ribs on the table. And because the Republic's budget includes a line item for a town musician. And because in Ethan's notebook, every refugee's name is written down. She said that this isn't a dream, it's a fact. Ethan looked at her. She was smiling, quietly, as always. He said, "Thank you." She leaned down and kissed him on the forehead. "Silly boy," she said. Then she picked up her guitar and went to bed. On the 10th day, they saw the tower. It jutted out of the ground like a broken tooth, a former skyscraper, 30 stories tall. The upper half had collapsed, the lower half was still standing. Dead earth lay all around it, gray, cracked, not a blade of grass. There were no mobs. Ethan had expected an army of level 70 creatures, but the area around the tower was empty, as if someone had cleared them away, or turned them off. They approached the entrance, glass doors, shattered. Beyond them lay the lobby, dusty, dark. A sign hung on the wall, floors 1 through 15. The elevator wasn't working. They climbed the stairs. 15 floors. Martha cursed on every one. Hannah checked April's pulse on every landing. J.A. didn't get out of breath at all. On the 15th floor was a door, open. Behind it was a room, a large one, glass walls, a panoramic view of the dead plane. In the center of the room stood a table. A person was sitting at the table. A woman, young, no older than 30. Short black hair, simple clothes, no weapons, no armor. A laptop sat on the table in front of her, an ordinary laptop with an apple on the lid. In a world where electricity was a luxury, this woman was sitting with a laptop. She looked up. She looked at Ethan, then at the 6 women behind him, then back at him. She said she'd been expecting an army. Ethan said she'd asked for no army. She said the other 6 had come with armies, despite her request. Ethan said he wasn't like the others. The woman smiled. Just a little. She said she knew. That was exactly why he was here. She said her name was Min, that she was the administrator, that she had created the system, that the breakthrough was her doing. She said this calmly, as if she were talking about the weather. Ethan stood there and listened. Hannah stood next to him. He could feel her tense up. 6 billion people lived on Earth before the breakthrough. 2 billion died in the first year. And here was the person who had done this, sitting at a table with a laptop. Ethan asked why. Min said that Earth was dying, not from monsters, from itself. Resources were running out. The climate was collapsing. Wars were breaking out. In 20 years, the planet would have become uninhabitable. She said that the system wasn't a punishment. It's a reboot, forced, brutal, but the only one that offered a chance. The system redistributes resources. It restores the ecosystem through territorial mechanics. It forces people to rebuild, from scratch, better. Ethan listened. Then he said, 2 billion dead. Min said that without the system, there would be 6 billion dead in 20 years. Ethan said it wasn't up to her to decide. Min said he was right, but she had decided, and now it was a fact. She said the Great Storm couldn't be stopped. It was built into the system. In 4 months, maximum rank mobs will attack all territories below level 3. Half the planet's population will perish if nothing is done. She said there's one way to stop the storm. If all 7 territories governed by the 7 unique classes unite into a single network, the system will recognize this as a victory condition. The storm will be canceled. The territories will receive permanent protection. Earth will be fully restored, without restrictions. She said she had been watching the 7 for 2 years. 5 of the 7 were building empires. 1 was building a trade network. 1 was building a republic. Ethan asked why she had called only him. Min said it was because the other 6 wouldn't come without an army. They wouldn't sit down at the table. They wouldn't listen. They would demand control over the system. She said that Ethan was the only one of the 7 who had never once tried to use his unique class for personal power. The only one who kept a notebook with names. The only one who came with 6 women and a folder of reports instead of an army. She said she was offering him a key, the access code to the system, an administrator's key. With it, he would be able to contact the other 6 leaders, to propose a union, not a conquest, but a union. A single network, 7 territories, 7 voices. She said it was his choice, to take the key or not. Ethan was silent. He looked out the window. The barren plain stretched to the horizon. Somewhere beyond it stood Willow. 30,000 people, warm bread, children with paper kites, a line item in the budget, city musician. He turned to his people. Hannah stood upright. Her hands were folded. Her eyes were calm. Eleanor was holding a folder. Her back was straight, as always. J.A. stood with her sword, ready for anything. Martha crossed her arms over her chest and looked at Min as if assessing the quality of her chair. April clutched a folder of harvest reports to her chest. Leah held her guitar behind her back. He asked what they thought. Hannah said, "Take it." Eleanor said the terms were acceptable as long as the key didn't grant control over people. J.A. said that if any of the 6 refused to join, she would convince them. Martha said she needed to build roads between the 7 territories and that she wanted to start yesterday. April quietly said that if the territories united, the area of arable land would increase 20-fold. Leah said nothing. She just nodded. Ethan turned to Min. He said he'd take the key on one condition. Min raised an eyebrow. Ethan said that once the storm was stopped and the territories were united, he wanted the system to allow people to grow wheat without permission, without quests, no levels, just land and grain, like before. Min looked at him for a long time. Then she said that this would require rewriting 16% of the system's code. Ethan said he'd wait. For the first time, Min smiled genuinely. She handed him a small crystal, blue, the size of a fingernail. He took it. The interface lit up. New lines of text, new menus, a world map. 7 points, 7 territories, 7 names. He saw them all. Victor Sterling, Crimson Dawn, Beijing, Dmitry Volkov, the Iron Throne, Vladivostok, Arthur Lancaster, House Lancaster, London. 4 more: South America, Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. He closed the map, put the crystal in his pocket, turned toward the exit. Min said, "Wait." He stopped. She said she'd been watching him for 2 years, watching him count sacks of flour, watching him ladle out soup for 8 hours straight, watching him write down names, watching him place ribs on the table for a girl who was never called by name. She said that Kingdom of Ash Online was created as a test. 30,000 players, 7 years. One condition: to find someone who could manage it without breaking it. She said he had passed. Ethan stood in the doorway. Then he said he hadn't passed the test. He'd just been cooking ribs according to his grandmother's recipe. He walked out. They descended 15 floors in silence. Out on the street, Martha said the climb up had been easier than the descent. Everyone knew that wasn't true. The return trip took 9 days. On the 10th day, they saw the walls of willow, white, sturdy. Smoke from the chimneys. Red was standing on the wall. He saw them first. He shouted. The gates opened. Ethan entered his city. 30,000 people stood in the streets. Quiet. The summer of the second year was hot and long. April's fields were turning golden. 200 hectares of wheat swayed in the wind, and Ethan stood on the wall and looked at them every morning. It was a ritual. 5 minutes of silence, a mug of tea in his hand. Steam rose and dissipated in the warm air. Then he took a sip. He set the mug down on a ledge in the wall, and he'd walk back to headquarters. At headquarters, war awaited him. Not against people, against the system. After meeting with Victor, he began digging. Every evening after meetings and debriefings, he'd sit alone and scroll through the interface, looking for anomalies, inconsistencies, bugs, those little things that didn't fit the game's logic. And he found them. The first anomaly, the quest Awakening of the Earth, which he'd used to restore the soil, didn't exist in the system's quest database. He checked twice. He scrolled through the entire list of available quests from start to finish. 417 quests, not a single one with that name. Regular players couldn't see this quest. It was available only to him. It was as if someone had added it to the game on purpose, manually, for a specific user. The second anomaly, his inventory. He compared the list of items with his old account in Kingdom of Ash Online. To do this, he had to sit down and reconstruct the complete list of purchases from the past 7 years from memory. 90% matched. Every sack of flour, every token, every coin. But 10% were new. Items he had never bought. Blessed fertilizer. He thought he'd bought it during the fall event in the 3rd year. But now, as he tried to recall the exact date and circumstances of the purchase, he couldn't find that event in his memory. It was as if the memory had been inserted, neatly, professionally, so that he hadn't noticed the seam. The third anomaly, a passive skill, Quiet Merchant. Ethan had reread its description 20 times over the course of the week. As long as a player does not personally participate in combat or demonstrate combat strength, the system does not include them in the general player rankings. To an outside observer, they are simply a wealthy merchant without a class. This skill had no logs, in no other class, in no other game he knew of. It was created for a single purpose: to give Ethan time, to hide him from the radar while he built. Someone knew that this was exactly what he would need. The fourth anomaly, Victor Sterling. Ethan asked Eleanor to gather everything she could find out about the leaders of the largest clans. She worked for a month. She reached out to her old contacts at Lancaster House. She intercepted letters. She interviewed merchants and deserters. The result lay in a folder on his desk. Thick, heavy. Eleanor said it was the best intelligence work of her life. Ethan opened the folder, and the world changed. 7 names, 7 leaders, 7 unique classes. Victor Sterling, class, strategist, unique. Dmitry Volkov of the Iron Throne, commander class, unique. Arthur Lancaster of House Lancaster, sovereign class, unique. Amira al-Rashid of the Damascus Pact, architect class, unique. Nkeki Obiang of the Free Congo, healer class, unique. Ricardo Silva of the Amazonian Coalition, guardian class, unique. Chang Mei Lin of the Singapore Union, class, navigator, unique. 7 unique classes, 7 leaders, 7 territories, including him. Ethan sat and stared at the list. His fingers remained motionless on the table. He reread the names over and over. 7 finalists. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a selection process. He thought back to Kingdom of Ash Online. 30,000 players, years of tournaments, years of guild management, years of observation, years in which every click was recorded, every decision was analyzed, every conflict within the guild was tracked. Someone was watching them, all 30,000 of them, and chose 7. Those who know how to lead, those who build systems, those who guide people. 7 models of leadership, 7 approaches, 7 tests. The breach wasn't a catastrophe. The breach was the final exam, transferred from the simulator to the real world, where the stakes aren't gold or rankings, where lives are at stake. Ethan closed the folder. He stood up. He walked over to the window. Outside, Willow was going about its evening routine. In the square, Leah was singing for the children. Martha was supervising the evening shift at the new warehouse construction site. April was walking back from the field with 3 assistants. Each was carrying a basket of soil samples. G.A. was training behind the barracks. Alone, as always. Her sword traced lines in the air that the naked eye couldn't follow fast enough. All of this was real. All of this had been built by real people. And it all began when someone decided to test 30,000 players for their suitability to rule the world. He told only Hannah about it, at night, in the hospital, when everyone had left. The hospital had grown over the course of 2 years. 4 wards, an operating room, a pharmacy, a staff room, 12 employees. Hannah ran it like a small hospital, with a schedule, with shifts, with reports she submitted to Ethan every Friday. Ethan sat on the edge of a couch in an empty ward and spoke softly. The door was closed. The candlelight flickered on the walls. He said that the world of Ash was no accident, that someone had created it, intentionally, that this someone was watching, that he had administrator access, that the system obeys him, that Kingdom of Ash Online was a simulator, not a game, that the 7 leaders were 7 test subjects who'd been released into the labyrinth to see who would make it out. Hannah listened in silence. She sat in a chair across from him, her hands on her knees, her face expressionless. When he finished, she remained silent for another minute. Then she asked what this meant for Willow. Ethan said it meant the rules of the game could change at any moment, that the difficulty would increase, that at some point, no city would be able to survive on its own, that this was exactly what the administrator wanted, to force everyone to unite or destroy one another. Only one model would survive, the one that proved viable. Hannah asked what kind of model Victor had. Ethan said an empire, a rigid hierarchy, one leader, everyone obeys, efficient, fast, brutal. Resources are allocated from the top. Dissenters are eliminated. It works as long as the leader is alive and smart. It collapses when the leader makes a mistake or dies. Hannah asked what model Dmitry Volkov had. Ethan said it's a military dictatorship, similar to Victor's, but harsher. Less economy, more bayonets. It works as long as there's an enemy. Without an enemy, it starts to devour itself. Hannah asked what his model was. Ethan said it's a republic, horizontal, many voices, slow, complex, fragile on the surface, but stable, because when a leader dies, an empire collapses. But a republic carries on, because it doesn't rest on a single person. It rests on a notebook with 3 columns, on a schedule, on a budget, on the fact that everyone knows their role and everyone knows their neighbor's name. Hannah was silent. Then she said she liked his model. But as a doctor, she wanted to say one thing. The model doesn't work if its creator hasn't slept for 3 nights in a row. Ethan smirked. She wasn't joking. She walked over to him. She placed her hand on his forehead. She checked his temperature. She said he had a fever, 37.8. He said that was normal. She said that 36.6 was normal, and 37.8 was the start of that conversation where she locks him in the ward and doesn't let him out for 2 days. He said he had a meeting in the morning. She said the meeting could wait. He looked at her. She looked at him, with that look that makes patients not argue. He lay down. She covered him with a blanket. She blew out the candle. She paused at the door. She said quietly that he wasn't alone, no matter what happened. She left. Ethan lay in the darkness and thought that this woman had saved his life at least 10 times over the past 2 years. Not from swords, not from monsters, from himself. At the end of summer, 2 events occurred that changed everything. The first, the system issued a global announcement to all players on the planet simultaneously. Blue text across the entire screen, large letters. Attention! In 6 months, the event will be activated. The Great Storm. All territories below Level 3 will be attacked by a wave of maximum rank mobs. Recommendation: band together or perish. Ethan read this while standing on the wall, morning tea in hand. Eleanor and Gia stood nearby. Eleanor read the text twice. Then she turned pale. She said this was the end. For small communities, for individual cities, for anyone not part of a major alliance, for half the planet's population. Gia read it once. She said the mob's maximum rank was level 80 and above. Dragons, liches, titans, elite bosses. No city except for the 3 largest clans would be able to withstand such a wave, and even the 3 largest would lose thousands. Ethan was silent. He stood there, looking at the fields beyond the wall. The wheat swayed in the wind. People worked in rows, tiny figures with hoes and baskets. He thought that in 6 months, all of this might cease to exist. Then he thought, no, it can't. It has no right to. He finished his tea, set down his mug, turned to Eleanor. Said that this wasn't the end. It was a move. The Great Storm in 6 months. It was the administrator's move. Pressure, a coercion to unite. The administrator was raising the stakes. He was telling all 7 of them the same thing. Enough of playing at your little kingdoms. Either you come to an agreement or the world will end. Eleanor asked, agree with whom? Ethan said, with everyone. Eleanor said that Victor Sterling wouldn't come to an agreement. Dmitry Volkov certainly wouldn't. Arthur Lancaster would sooner burn his London to the ground than share power. Ethan said that was their problem. His job was to find a way. The second event took place that same evening. The sun was setting over the fields. The sky was ablaze with orange and red. Ethan stood on the wall. His people were nearby. Hannah, with a medical tablet on which she kept track of disease statistics. Eleanor, with a folder of diplomatic correspondence. J.A. with a sword on her back. A familiar pose, arms crossed, an alert gaze. Martha, with blueprints for the new neighborhood she was planning for the winter. April held a handful of grain from the new harvest. She cradled it in her palm and examined each kernel. Leah held a guitar. She quietly plucked the strings. Not a melody, just sounds. Warm, random. Down in the square, children were flying paper kites. Martha had made them from old blueprints and scraps of fabric. Thin wooden frames, bright patches of cloth, strings made of sinew. The children ran around the square shouting. The kites soared into the evening sky. The first paper kites in this world since the day of the breakthrough. Ethan watched them. The system interface flashed before his eyes. A new line, one that hadn't been there before. A different font. Not the system standard. Smaller, in italics, as if handwritten. Player Ethan_Park. The administrator wants to speak with you. Ethan read the line. His heart skipped a beat. Hard. Then it settled. He gave nothing away. Silently, he closed the panel. He watched the kites for another minute. The children, the fields beyond the wall, the smoke from the chimneys, the long shadow of the wall falling across the golden wheat. Then he turned to his people. They were looking at him. Hannah noticed something in his expression. She always did. He said, "It looks like we have a meeting with a stakeholder. Let's get ready." Silence. Then Leah laughed. She was the first. Loudly, openly, as loudly as she could. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. Just one. A perfect, aristocratic eyebrow. J.A. placed her hand on the hilt of her sword. They set out on the 20th day. 10 days for preparation. 10 days for the journey. Ethan wanted a buffer. He always wanted a buffer. That's what the product manager inside him had taught him. Set aside 20% for the unexpected, or 30, or 50 if you're crossing the death zone to find the man who wiped out a third of humanity. Ethan, Hannah, Eleanor, J.A., Martha, April, Leah. 7 people. No army, just as agreed. He thought long and hard about who to take. Red offered 100 militiamen. Tom suggested building a siege wagon. The mayor proposed sending a delegation of 20 representatives with flags and gifts. Ethan turned them all down. He said he would go with those who had been with him from the start, with those who know everything, with those he trusts unconditionally. 6 women and him. Red said it was madness. Ethan said that his entire business plan had been madness from day one. No one would call flour from the air or soldiers who don't breathe a sensible decision either. A crowd stood at the gates of Willow. 30,000 people. They had arrived at dawn. They filled the main street from City Hall to the gates. They were standing on rooftops, on walls, in the square. They weren't shouting. They weren't waving flags. They were just standing there. 30,000 people were staring at the 7 of them. The mayor approached Ethan, this bald man with glasses held together with electrical tape, the same man who 2 years ago had been putting check marks next to the names of the elderly, preparing to cross them off the ration lists. He shook Ethan's hand. Then he hugged him, tightly, so tightly that Ethan's ribs cracked. Then he let go. He didn't say a word. Everything had been said. Red stood nearby, a former looter, now the militia commander. He said he would wait, that if Ethan didn't return in 20 days, he would lead the militia to the tower. Ethan said there was no need. Red said he wasn't asking. Ethan looked at him. He nodded. Tom, the carpenter, was standing by the gate, the very gate he'd built a year and a half ago out of logs and iron hinges. He said the walls would hold, no matter what happened. Ethan said he had no doubt. Tom handed him a small wooden block, smoothly sanded, with the letter W carved into it. Willow. He said it was for good luck. Ethan put it in his pocket. They walked out through the gate. The road led northwest. Eleanor led the way. She walked with confidence. The map was in her head, every turn, every ravine, every rock. She'd memorized the route during 10 days of preparation and hadn't once taken out the paper version. Her memory was a weapon no less precise than Ji-ah's sword. Ji-ah walked ahead, her sword drawn. She hadn't sheathed it for a single minute during the entire 10-day journey. She slept with her sword. She ate with her sword. She was level 60 now. In 2 years at Willow, she had risen 13 levels. Not because she fought a lot, but because she trained every day. In the morning before dawn, in the evening after dinner. Alone on the training ground behind the barracks. Strike after strike. Thousands of strikes. Ethan knew this because Hannah complained at every medical checkup that Ji-ah would come in with scraped knuckles and bruises on her forearms from striking wooden posts. He once asked Ji-ah why she trained so hard if Willow was safe. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said that Willow was safe because she was training. He didn't argue. The first skirmish happened on the 3rd day. They were making their way through the ruins of a small town. The walls had collapsed, the roofs had caved in, grass had sprouted through the asphalt. It was quiet. Too quiet. Ji-ah stopped. She raised her hand. Everyone froze. 4 ogres emerged from the rubble, huge, gray skin, clubs made from torn-out posts. Level 52, average by Wild Zone standards, death by ordinary human standards. Ji-ah took a step forward. Ethan wanted to tell her to be careful. He opened his mouth. He didn't manage to utter a single sound. She moved so fast that all he saw was a streak of silvery light, as if someone had swept a brush through the air. The sword flashed. Once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. 4 strikes, 4 bodies. The ogres fell one after another, heavily, with a crash. They scattered into sparks of system energy, blue, bright, like little fireworks. Ji-ah turned around. She didn't have a single scratch on her. She wasn't even out of breath. She said one word. Boring. Martha said that young people these days are ill-mannered. Hannah said she wanted to examine Ji-ah for microtraumas. Ji-ah said she had no microtraumas. Hannah said that was for her to decide. Everyone laughed. Except the ogres. They continued on their way. The landscape changed. Green hills gave way to gray plains. The grass grew sparse. The trees stood bare, dry, dead. The ground beneath their feet grew harder, drier. The system marked it as a depleted, level 0 resource. April walked along, staring at the soil. From time to time, she bent down. She'd scoop up a handful. She'd rub it between her fingers. Ethan saw her frown. This land was dead, not just depleted, dead. No amount of blessed fertilizer would help as long as level 70 mobs roamed nearby. He thought that if the administrator was telling the truth and there was a way to lift the system's restrictions, then this land could come back to life. All of it. Millions of hectares. In the evenings, Leah played, by the campfire, in the darkness, without words, just a melody, soft, slow. The sounds of the guitar drifted over the dead plain and made it seem less dead. Martha listened and mended her boots. Eleanor listened and reread her notes. Hannah listened and checked the first aid kit. April listened and was the first to fall asleep. J.A. was on watch and pretended not to be listening, but Ethan saw her tilt her head slightly toward the campfire whenever Leah hit a high note. On the 7th day, Leah sat down next to him by the campfire. Everyone else was already asleep, except for J.A., who was patrolling the perimeter. Moonlight lay across the plain in white patches. It was quiet. So quiet that Ethan could hear his own breathing. Leah said quietly that she wanted to ask him something. He said he was listening. She asked if he was afraid. He didn't answer right away. He stared at the embers, organizations die in darkness. Then he said yes. She asked what he was afraid of. He said he was afraid of a few things. He was afraid that the administrator might be right, that the world could only survive under a single leader, that the Republic is a beautiful dream that doesn't work when dragons fly overhead. He's afraid that Victor Sterling is right, that in the end, the one who's willing to burn down the village wins. He's afraid that in 4 months, the great storm will wipe Willow off the map, and with it, everything he's built. Notebooks, budgets, schedules. On Wednesdays, the city musician line, everything will turn to ash. Leah was silent for a long time. The embers crackled. Somewhere far off, a mob passed by. Heavy footsteps, right past them, not heading their way. Then she said that a dream works if people believe in it. But people don't believe in dreams. People believe in the smell of bread, in a warm blanket, in the fact that there will be breakfast tomorrow morning, in the fact that someone wrote your name in a notebook, not a number, a name. She said that every Wednesday, J.A.'s table is set with braised ribs made according to his grandmother's recipe. And J.A. eats them and doesn't say thank you because he doesn't know how. But after dinner on Wednesday, she trains for 2 hours longer because she has something to defend. She said that in the Republic's budget, there's a line item, city musician, and that this line appeared before the line for the manager's salary, and that every time she sees this line in the report, she thinks this world is worth a song. She said that in Ethan's notebook, every refugee has a name written down, and an age, and that he loves to eat. And that this isn't a dream, it's a fact. The fact that for one person in this world, each of the 30,000 is not a number, but a name. Ethan looked at her. She was smiling, quietly, warmly, like the glow of embers. He wanted to say something. He couldn't find the words. She leaned down and kissed him on the forehead, gently, like a breath of air. She said softly, "Silly boy, I already knew. About the inventory, about the caravans, about everything. Let's go to sleep." Ethan froze. She said she knew. He asked how long she'd known. She said since the 3rd month, when he was unloading the sacks into the warehouse at night and thought no one was watching. But she wasn't asleep. She never sleeps before midnight. She sat on the roof of the neighboring house with her guitar and saw the sacks appear out of thin air. She didn't tell anyone, because it was his business, because it didn't matter where the bags came from. What mattered was that he hauled them until his hands went numb, for people he'd seen for the first time in his life. Ethan was silent. She stood up, slung her guitar over her back, walked toward her sleeping bag, stopped, turned around, said that when they got back, she wanted to write a song about a city that smells like bread. He said it was a good idea. She said she knew. She left. Ethan sat by the dying campfire and thought that in the 2 years he'd been in this world, he hadn't cried once. Not when he hauled sacks at night, not when he ladled out soup for 8 hours straight, not when the first crop sprouted from the ground. And now his eyes were wet, because the barista from Portland had told him he was a fool, and she kissed him on the forehead. On the 10th day, they saw the tower. It jutted out of the dead earth like a giant's broken tooth, a former skyscraper, glass and concrete. It had once been 30 stories tall. The upper half had collapsed. Reinforcing bars jutted from the rubble like the ribs of a giant skeleton. The lower half still stood, leaning slightly to the east, but it stood. Dead earth lay all around it, gray, cracked. Not a blade of grass, not a sound, not a breath of wind. Even the polygonal cracks in the sky were wider here, brighter, as if the fabric of the world had thinned to its limit. There were no mobs. Ethan had expected an army of creatures of level 70 and higher. Eleanor had warned him about them. Her father's scouts had perished here. But the area around the tower was empty, clear, as if someone had turned them off, removed from the board, with a single swipe of the admin cursor. They approached the entrance, glass doors, shattered, shards on the floor. Beyond them, the lobby, dusty, dark. A sign hung on the wall. Floors 1 through 15, offices, conference rooms, cafeteria. The elevator isn't working. Please use the stairs. Please. That word was from the old world, from a world where there were elevators and cafeterias and signs with polite requests. They climbed the stairs, 15 floors. Martha cursed on every flight. On the 5th, she said it was worse than building a wall with her bare hands. On the 10th, she said that the architect of this building deserved a special place in hell. On the 13th, she fell silent. She was conserving her breath. Hannah checked April's pulse on every landing. April was the smallest and most fragile, but she didn't complain. She walked in silence, a backpack on her back. Inside the backpack was a folder with reports, yields, acreage, forecasts, soil data, grain samples in little bags. Ethan asked why she'd brought that with her. She stopped, adjusted her glasses, said that if the administrator wanted to talk, he should see what they'd built. Not walls, not an army. Fields, ears of grain. Grain. Living earth that feeds people. She said that this was the most important thing, more important than swords, gold, and magic, because swords protect, but the earth feeds. And when swords rust, the earth still feeds. Ethan looked at her, small, quiet, wearing round glasses fogged up from the climb, with a handful of grain in her jacket pocket. The very same girl who, 2 years ago, had sat on her knees in the mud and talked to the dead earth. He thought she was right. She was always right. GA wasn't out of breath at all, level 60, physical abilities far beyond those of an ordinary person. She stood on the 15th floor landing, waiting for the others. When they reached her, she looked at Martha. Martha said, "Just try saying something." J.A. said nothing, but Ethan saw the hint of a smile. On the 15th floor was a door, open, glass. A sign hung on it, Conference Room A. Behind the door was a room, a large one, 40 by 40 meters, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, a panoramic view of the dead plain, of the gray earth stretching to the horizon, of the sky with its polygonal cracks, of the void. In the center of the room stood a table, an ordinary office table, white, plastic, just like the conference rooms Ethan had seen hundreds of times in his past life. A person was sitting at the table, a woman, young, no older than 30, short black hair, simple clothes, jeans, a gray t-shirt, sneakers. No weapons, no armor, no system effects. She looked like someone who had stepped out for coffee on a Sunday. A laptop sat on the desk in front of her, an ordinary laptop with an apple on the lid. The screen was lit up. The screen displayed graphs, lots of graphs. In a world where electricity was a luxury and people burned candles, this woman sat with her laptop looking at graphs. She looked up when they entered. She looked at Ethan, then at the 6 women behind him, then back at him. She said she'd been expecting an army. Her voice was ordinary, calm, no echo, no effects. The voice of a human, not a god. Ethan said she'd asked for no army. She tilted her head slightly. She said the other 6 had been given the same condition. All 6 had come with armies. Victor Sterling had brought 1,000 players. Dmitry Volkov had brought 2 regiments. Arthur Lancaster brought his personal guard and 24 knights. She met with each of them. All 6 demanded the same thing: control over the system. All 6 left empty-handed. Ethan said he wasn't like the others. The woman smiled just a little at the corners of her lips. She said she knew. That was exactly why he was here. She said her name was Min Zhao, that she was the administrator, that she had created the system, that the breakthrough was her work. She said it calmly, like a report, like an entry in a spreadsheet. Input, output, result. Ethan stood and listened. Hannah stood beside him. He felt her tense up. He felt her fingers clench. Hannah, who had closed the eyes of 23 people at Willow Hospital over the past 2 years, who had lost 47 before Willow, who remembered every single name. Now she was standing 3 meters away from the man who had killed 2 billion. And she was silent. Because Ethan was silent. Ethan asked why. Min turned her laptop toward him. A graph was on the screen. The red line was rising, steeply, inexorably. Depletion of the planet's resources, forecast. Next to it was a second line, blue, also rising. Average temperature. Next to that was a third, black, falling. Biodiversity. All 3 lines intersected at a single point, 20 years after the breakthrough. There was a mark at that point, the point of no return. Min said that Earth was dying, not from monsters, from itself. Resources were running out. The climate was collapsing. The oceans were acidifying. The soil was becoming depleted. Wars over water were breaking out in 4 regions simultaneously. In 20 years, the planet would become uninhabitable, not partially, completely. She said that the system wasn't a punishment. It was a reboot, forced, brutal, but the only one that offered a chance. The system redistributes resources. It restores the ecosystem through territorial mechanics. It forces people to rebuild, from scratch, by different rules. Rules where you can't just suck the land dry and leave, where you have to clean it up first, then restore it, then plant it, then harvest it, step by step, like in a game. Ethan listened. Then he said quietly that 2 billion people had died. Min didn't look away. She said that without the system, in 20 years, there would have been 6 billion dead, 0 survivors, 0 chances. She said she'd done the calculations, thousands of models, thousands of scenarios. Every scenario without the system ended the same way. Ethan said it wasn't up to her to decide how many people live and how many die. Min said he was right. But she'd decided. And now it was a fact. 2 billion was the price. A terrible, impossible price, one that keeps her awake every night. But it's a fact. Ethan was silent. He looked at the graphs, at the red line, the blue one, the black one. He was a product manager. He knew how to read graphs. He could see she wasn't lying. The lines were real. The data was real. The forecast was real. He didn't forgive her, but he understood. Min said the Great Storm was real. It's built into the system's core. In 4 months, max-rank mobs will attack all territories below level 3. The wave will sweep from the edges of the continents toward the center. It will engulf everything, every city, every settlement, every farm. Half of the planet's remaining population will perish if nothing is done. She said the storm cannot be stopped. She built it in as a safety mechanism, as a last resort, to force the 7 to unite. She said there's one way, the only way. If all 7 territories, ruled by 7 unique classes, unite into a single network, voluntarily, without coercion. Each leader must activate their key, simultaneously. The system will recognize this as the victory condition. The storm will be canceled. The toilets will receive permanent 3rd-level protection. The land would be restored completely. No quests, no levels, no permissions. Just the land and grain, like before. She said she'd been watching the Seven for 2 years. 5 of the 7 were building empires, rigid hierarchies, one voice, subordination, resources flowing from the top down. One built a trade network, efficient, profitable, but without people at its core. One built a republic, slowly, haphazardly, with an accounting notebook and 3 columns, a city musician on the budget, ribs on Wednesdays, names in a notebook. Ethan asked why she'd called him last. Min said he wasn't last, the only one. The other 6 came on their own, without an invitation, with armies. They demanded the key. She refused all 6 of them, because the administrator's key in Victor Sterling's hands means the end, not salvation. An empire with absolute power over the system. She said that Ethan was the only one of the 7 who had never once tried to use his unique class for personal power. The only one who keeps a notebook with names instead of numbers. The only one who came with 6 women and a folder of reports instead of an army. The only one who, for 2 years in a row, every Wednesday, served braised ribs to a 19-year-old girl. She said that Kingdom of Ash Online was created as a test. 30 per 10,000 players, 7 years, millions of decisions. One selection criterion: to find someone who could lead without breaking things. Someone who sees people, not as resources, not as units, but as people. She said he had passed. Ethan stood in the conference room on the 15th floor of a dead skyscraper. Beyond the glass walls lay a gray void. Behind him stood 6 women. A doctor, a diplomat, a warrior, an engineer, an agronomist, a musician. He turned to face them. Hannah stood upright. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her eyes were calm. The same Hannah who had come for antibiotics 2 years ago and hadn't asked where they came from, who had silently kept his secret, who had fed him sandwiches and locked him in his room when he had a fever. Eleanor was holding a folder. Her back was straight, as always. An earring in her left ear. Just one. She never got around to replacing the other one. She said it was a reminder of the price of escape and the price of freedom. J.A. stood with her sword, her left hand on the hilt, her right hand free, ready for anything. 19 years old. No, 21 already. 2 years had passed. She'd grown up, not just in levels. Martha crossed her arms over her chest. She looked at Min as if assessing a load-bearing structure, figuring out whether it would hold or not. April clutched her backpack close to her chest. It held a folder of reports and little bags of grain. Small, quiet, the most important person in the Republic. Leah held her guitar behind her back. She was smiling. She was always smiling, even here, even now. Ethan asked what they thought. Hannah said one word: take it. Eleanor said the terms were acceptable as long as the key didn't grant control over people, only over the system. As long as it was a tool, not a weapon. Min nodded. Eleanor said, then it's acceptable. J.A. said that if any of the 6 refused to join forces, she would convince them, personally. Eleanor said, that's called diplomacy. G.A. said she knew. Martha said she needed to build roads between the 7 territories, proper ones, with pavement, with bridges, with lane markings, and that she wanted to start yesterday. April quietly said that if the territories united and the land fully recovered, the area of arable land would increase 20-fold. She said she could feed the world if they gave her land and people. Leah said nothing. She just nodded, once, and that was enough. Ethan turned to Min. He said he'd take the key, on one condition. Min raised an eyebrow. Ethan said that once the storm was stopped and the territories were united, he wanted one thing: for the system to allow people to grow wheat without permission, without quests, no rituals, no territory levels, just the land, just the grain, just their hands, like before all this. Min looked at him for a long time. The laptop screen glowed in her face. The graphs were still crawling across the screen. A red line, blue, black. Then she said it would require rewriting 16% of the system's code. 4 million lines, 3 months of work. Ethan said he'd wait. He was used to waiting. For 2 years, he'd built a city from a population of 200. He'd wait another 3 months. For the first time, Min smiled genuinely, not just at the corners of her lips, with her whole face. For a second, she didn't look like the administrator who had killed 2 billion. She looked like a 30-year-old woman who was very tired and had been waiting a very long time for someone to say the right words. She held out a small crystal to him, blue, the size of a thumbnail, transparent. Spots shimmered inside it, like stars. He took it. The crystal settled in his palm, warm, light. The interface flashed to life. New lines, new menus, everything was different, deeper, broader. He saw the system from the inside, not as a user, as an administrator. A map of the world unfolded before him, vast, detailed. 7 points glowed on it, 7 territories, 7 names. Victor Sterling, Crimson Dawn, Beijing, Dmitry Volkov, the Iron Throne, Vladivostok, Arthur Lancaster, House Lancaster, London, Amira al-Rashid, the Damascus Pact, Damascus, Nkeki Obiang, Free Congo, Kinshasa, Ricardo Silva, the Amazon Coalition, Manaus, Chiang Mai-Lin, the Singapore Union, Singapore, and him, Ethan Pack, the Republic of Willow. A tiny dot on the map, the smallest of the 7, but the brightest. He closed the map. He put the crystal in his pocket, next to the wooden block Tom had given him. He turned toward the exit. Min said, "Wait." He stopped. She said she'd been watching him for 2 years, every single day, watching him count bags of flour at 2 in the morning, watching him serve soup for 8 hours straight in the square until his hands went numb, watching him write down names in a notebook, ages, favorite foods, watching him repair the water pump with bronze fittings from game props, watching him set ribs on the table for a girl who'd been called Number her whole life, watching him, in the midst of all the construction, tell a woman with an adjustable wrench that she's the most beautiful woman in the Republic, watching him enter city musician into the budget before he even enters his own salary. She said that Kingdom of Ash Online had been in development for 13 years, long before Ethan started playing. 30,000 players had passed through it, billions of decisions, trillions of interactions. One selection criterion, not the strongest, not the smartest, not the most ruthless, the one who would lead without breaking. She said he had passed. Ethan stood in the doorway. Light from the panoramic windows fell on his back. A long shadow lay across the conference room floor. Then he said he hadn't passed any test. He'd just been cooking ribs using his grandmother's recipe, and writing down names because every person has a name, and paying the musician because a city without music isn't a city. And he counted the bags because if he didn't count them, someone would go hungry. He said it wasn't a test, it was just the right thing to do. Min was silent. Then she said quietly, "That's exactly why." He left. They walked down 15 floors in silence. Only footsteps. Just breathing. On the 5th floor, Martha said that going up was easier than going down. Hannah said that from a medical standpoint, that wasn't true. Martha said that from an engineering standpoint, it was very much true. Everyone knew that neither was true, but they smiled. It was bright outside. The sun was high in the sky. The dead plane surrounding the tower lay gray and motionless, but Ethan looked at it differently. He didn't see emptiness. He saw fields that didn't exist yet, roads that didn't exist yet, cities that didn't exist yet. He saw work, a lot of work, years worth, maybe decades worth. The return trip took 9 days. They walked faster. They knew the route. They knew where it was dangerous. They knew where they could take a shortcut. Jia killed 6 more mobs along the way, each time with a single blow. Each time, it was boring. On the 5th day, April stopped for a rest. She got down on her knees. She touched the ground, gray and lifeless. Then she looked at Ethan. She said that in a year, this land would be black, alive. She could feel it. Ethan said he believed her. On the 9th day, at sunset, from the top of the last hill, they saw Willow. The walls, white in the sunset light, smoke from the chimneys, golden fields beyond the wall, tiny figures of people on the walls. Ethan stood on the hill and watched. 6 women stood beside him. No one spoke. Then Leah said quietly that home was beautiful. Ethan thought so too. Beautiful. They walked down the hill. Red was standing by the wall. He was the first to see them. He shouted. His voice echoed along the wall. People ran over. They looked. They shouted down. "They're coming! They're coming!" The gates opened. Heavy wooden leaves. The hinges creaked. Tom had built them with great care. Ethan entered his city. 30,000 people stood in the streets, in the square, on the rooftops. Quiet, they watched. Ethan walked down the main street toward City Hall. People stood on either side. They parted. He saw faces, familiar ones, every single one. Harold Watkins, with his bad knees, stood in the 3rd row. May, who loves sweets but doesn't like rice, stood on the porch of the bakery. She was already 9. She'd grown up. Dan Park, his namesake, stood by the workshop with his arms crossed, smiling. Tom the carpenter stood by the town hall gate and nodded. The mayor was waiting on the porch. Ethan climbed the steps. The mayor held out his hand. Ethan shook it. Then he went inside. He sat down at the table. His table. The one he'd sat at for 2 years, on which lay 3 notebooks. On which stood a mug with the dregs of tea. He opened a notebook, the first one, that very one, with 3 columns, income, expenses, balance. He found a blank page. He wrote the date. Then he wrote a single word, beginning. He put a period. He looked at that word, beginning, not the end, not the finale, not the conclusion. Beginning. Because everything that came before was preparation. 2 years, 30,000 people, walls, fields, notebooks, budgets. All of that was the first act. Now the second was beginning. An hour later, he was sitting in headquarters. On the wall in front of him hung a map of the world with 7 glowing dots. A crystal projected it directly onto the whitewashed wall. 7 territories, 7 leaders, 4 months until the storm. His people stood nearby, all of them. Hannah with the medical protocols. She had already drawn up a medical aid plan for each of the 7 territories. The gift of connection, a gift that cannot be refused. Medicines, vaccines, surgical care. She said that disease knows no borders and that a doctor is the best ambassador. Eleanor with a draft of diplomatic letters to the 6 leaders. Each letter is in 2 languages, with the Willow Trading Company seal, with a coat of arms she designed herself, an ear of wheat on a blue background. She said the coat of arms should symbolize peace, not a lion, not a sword, an ear of wheat. J.A. with a sword on her back and ready to personally deliver every letter. She said that if Victor Sterling refused to read a letter, she'd shove it up his so he'd read it from the inside. Eleanor said that wasn't diplomacy. GA said it was effective, though. Martha with her roadmaps, 7 routes, 7 territories, bridges, stations, warehouses at every intersection. She said that a world without roads isn't a world, it's a collection of islands. And the islands are sinking, one by one. April with a crop plan. Not for Willow, for everyone, for 1,000,000 hectares, for all the reclaimed land. She said she has seeds that grow in any climate: wheat, rice, potatoes, corn. She said this is the best gift for first contact, better than gold, better than swords. A sack of seeds that speaks. We don't want your land. We want your land to feed your people. Leah with a guitar. She said she would write 7 versions of one song, a different one for each territory, in their language, to their melody, because a song is what people listen to when they stop listening to words. Ethan looked at them. 6 women, a doctor, a diplomat, a warrior, an engineer, an agronomist, a musician. He thought about how 2 years ago he'd been lying face down on the wet grass, under a gray sky, with polygonal cracks overhead, listening to a child cry. He had nothing, except for supplies that would run out sooner or later, except for a notebook, except for a pencil. Now he had a city, 30,000 names in his notebook, a union of 7 communities, a team he trusted without words, and a crystal in his pocket, next to a wooden block marked with the letter U. He thought his grandmother would be pleased. She always said that ribs should be cooked for a long time over low heat, and that the most important thing is patience. He opened Facebook. He found Victor Sterling's contact info. He looked at the name. He thought for a moment. Then he wrote his first message. We need to talk. Not about the war. About wheat. He sent it. Then he found Dmitry Volkov's contact. He wrote the same thing. Then to Arthur Lancaster, to Amir al-Rashid, to Nkeki Obiang, to Ricardo Silva, to Zhang Meilin. 7 messages, 7 identical lines. We need to talk. Not about the war, about wheat. He closed the interface, leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, looked out the window. Willow Creek lay beyond the wall. Smoke rose from the chimneys. In the square, children were flying paper kites. The smell of bread wafted from the bakery, warm, with a crispy crust. From beyond the wall, through the open window of headquarters, the sound of a guitar drifted in. Leah was sitting somewhere on the porch, strumming the strings. A quiet melody drifted over the town, without words. Hannah was pouring tea. She brought a tray with 7 mugs. She set one in front of each of them. Ethan took his, hot green tea, that very one, from the stash. The last pack. He'd been saving it, for a special occasion. Hannah knew. She always knew. April sat in the corner, jotting something down in her notebook. Small, worn. On the cover was a dried ear of wheat. That very one. The first, from the first harvest. Eleanor was proofreading a letter to Arthur Lancaster, her father. Her handwriting was even. Her hand didn't tremble. Martha was laying out blueprints on the floor because there wasn't enough room on the table. She was kneeling, tracing the lines of the roads with her finger. She was muttering something in Russian. G.A. stood by the door, her back to the wall, her arms crossed, a sword behind her back, her eyes closed. But Ethan knew she wasn't asleep. She never sleeps when he's in the room. On guard, as always. Just like the first day when he set a plate of ribs in front of her and asked what she liked to eat. Every Wednesday since then, without exception. He looked at all of them, then at the map on the wall. 7 dots, 4 months, 6 rounds of negotiations, 1 storm, and a whole world that didn't need to be conquered, but fed. He finished his tea, set down the gum, picked up a pencil. That very same stub of a pencil the mayor had given him 2 years ago, worn down to half its length, but it still writes. He opened his notebook to a new page, wrote the title, Sprint Number 1, Operation Wheat. Below that, the first line, the task. To convince the 6 most stubborn people on the planet to unite voluntarily, in 4 months, without war, without coercion, with a bag of seeds and a folder of reports. He looked at what he'd written, smiled, then put a period, and began to count.